Hello, intrepid internet traveler. I am Fathom, and what follows is a labor of love which has been a big part of my life for about the last 7 months. It is a track-by-track journey through what is, subjectively speaking, one of the greatest albums of all time, Revolver by the Beatles. It has been a joy and an honor to make, and I hope you enjoy it. Here we go. Chapter 1. Taxman. So this seems like a good time, the beginning, to do a quick recap of what the Beatles have been up to since they finished recording Rubber Soul. Rubber Soul is released in December of 1965. It is wildly successful, namely because it's excellent. In 1963, 64, and 65, the Beatles released 2 albums a year. In the latter 2 of those years, the Beatles did a film with an accompanying album, as that seemed to be a bit of a lucrative winning model. Brian Epstein wanted them to do the exact same thing in 1966, and the Beatles were like, no, Brian, we are doing no more movies, thank you very much. Of course, they did do later movies, but that's irrelevant, I'm making a point. Suddenly, our 4 Beatles found themselves with 3 months of free time on their hands. They had not had this basically since the band began to become popular, essentially 1962. So our guys spent 3 months enriching their minds and doing things like going to avant-garde concerts, reading Timothy Leary, consuming North Indian classical music, dropping loads of acid. They came together in early April 1966 and spent the next 2.5 months making what is arguably the best pop rock album of all time, Revolver. And this is how it begins. Just kidding. It starts like this.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2.
We jump into this album on Taxman. I think that just about every Beatles album has a perfectly chosen opener, and this album is no exception. I think that Taxman is the perfect choice to open Revolver. Indeed, I think that Taxman is kind of our roadmap to Revolver, and today we're going to delve into why I believe that to be the case. As a broad summary though, this is the right song to open the album because it introduces us to all of these new concepts that we're going to get to explore with the Beatles over the course of our experience listening to the album. Here are some of the main elements that we're going to look into today. The way that their lyrical content is moving away from like superficial romance and into something a lot more political and philosophical. The way that the Beatles are now using the studio as an instrument in its own right. The way that this is going to be an album that is harder and heavier than Rubber Soul. In a lot of ways, I think more musical than Rubber Soul, and how this album is going to innovate, both in the way that it was recorded and in the influences that are being brought to the fore. Let's go! Let's look at our first element, politics. Taxman is arguably, actually I scratched that, it is inarguably the Beatles' most political song to date, up until 1966. And to dig into that, we're going to call on our newest recruit, the political correspondent. Yes, thank you very much. Pleased to be on the team. What we've been able to ascertain is that at the time that Revolver was being written, the Labour Party was in government in Britain, and Prime Minister Harold Wilson had implemented a series of progressive tax initiatives, which meant that of what they had earned, Britain's highest earners were paying approximately 90% back to the government. Of course, nowadays we've got super billionaires who pay no taxes, but what do I know? Well, let's not get too political. Well, maybe next time you should bring on a diplomacy correspondent instead. Fair point. So in April of 1966, the Beatles were informed that 2 of them were nearing bankruptcy and 2 of them were not too far behind, despite their obvious success.
You're paying more money to the taxman than you are, you get so happy that you finally started earning money. And then you find out that, in those days we paid 19 shillings and sixpence out of every pound.
Hence, so in opening this album on a song about paying your taxes, as listeners, we're being introduced to the idea that this is not going to be your standard Beatles album about girls. On this album, we're going to encounter songs about sleeping, submersibles, singing birds, and the very nature of life and death, among other things. There are very few love songs on this album, and the worldview of these musicians is expanding. Let's look into how the Beatles have set out with the intention to use the studio as an instrument in and of itself and to sort of explore the capabilities within that. Like here, have a listen to the top of the song. This is the very first thing you hear when you drop the needle, as I'm about to.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2.
Here's what I can hear in that introduction. Obviously there's the silly count-in, somebody's coughing in the background, there's tape being wound or rewound, there's the actual count-in right at the end. 3, 4! Like this is a song, and indeed an album, that not only announces that we are in the studio, but invites us as the listener to come to the studio as well. We can hear the process. As far as I can remember, we've never had a Beatles track or record or whatever where we can hear what are essentially outtakes. We get to look behind the curtain on this song. We get a little glimpse of the process that is going into creating this piece of work. Art. This piece of art. Because that's what it is. Another way that this song demonstrates that we're going to get a lot more studio wizardry on this album is in the repetition of the solo. Middle of the song, outro. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know why I still say that. Like, you're definitely going to, but, you know, I guess it's to demonstrate that I am open to correction and mild, kind criticism. Any meanness and I come apart, but, you know, constructive criticism, I can take that. But my understanding is that they recorded that solo and then they took it and they copied it and chucked it on at the end as well. I suppose because they could. I mean, you can just re-record the solo, but no, they chose to use the studio to do that. Cool. This is an album that saw the use of various speeds, so like recording things at a certain speed and then slowing them down so that they sound different.
With the speeding up of the voice, of course, we can get unreal effects.
They're done by doubling the speed of the voice. Now, this puts the voice up an octave, exactly, in music.
Or that in reverse, like with Rain, which we'll come back to. Playing tapes in reverse.
But take the sound of an ordinary cymbal, for example. Have a listen to this. Now, have you heard it backwards?
And playing tape loops behind things in the recording. Changing how we use microphones in the studio revolutionized the entire industry. Automatic double tracking was invented. One of the engineers, whose name I've forgotten, but editor Nancy will tell you.
His name is Ken Townsend.
Basically invented this method of doubling your tracking in such a way that the artist only needs to record it once. Prior to that, if they wanted to thicken the tone of their vocals, they would have to sing their part, and then they would have to record themselves singing over that part again so that there were two of them.
It's not an easy task to double track your own voice. The timing's got to be perfect. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And I thought, you know, there must be an easier way of doing this.
John Lennon, in particular, hated this process. He found it very boring.
I've got two signals. One is the original signal, and then the same original signal, but delayed by about 100 milliseconds. I can put the two together and see what it sounds like. And it actually worked quite well. We played it, and John Lennon was most impressed, actually. He fell in love with it straight away.
That led to the creation of effects like chorus, which means that without this album, you couldn't have this. 1966 was the year that the Beatles started recording music that they knew that they couldn't reproduce live. We mentioned Paperback Writer in the last ELO episode. So many individual voices doing different things, they would need to bring in other musicians on stage in order to recreate that. So this was also the year that the Beatles stopped touring. At approximately the same time that this album was released, the Beatles were playing their final gig, not counting the rooftop. When they sat down to make this album, they'd already decided basically they weren't going to tour the album. And that gave them an enormous amount of freedom to expand musically. For instance, you can focus on your individual musical instrument in the knowledge that you won't have to both play it and sing at the same time, or remember lyrics, or remember harmonies. You can just really zero in on your craft as a musician. The best example of this is in Paul McCartney's bass line. Have a listen to this. In case you missed that, let's have the bass correspondent break down exactly what it is that Paul McCartney is playing there. In the Paul McCartney bass lines video that I made in November, It has been pointed out to me numerous times that I should have included Taxman. This is my opportunity to say it was a massive mistake to not include this song. I was under the mistaken impression that George Harrison was playing this bass line, and this is my moment to redeem myself. This is what is being played in the bridge of this song. Except he's playing it this fast. And no, I don't think I'm overthinking this, because this philosophy has definitely been corroborated by the Beatles and the people around them. We're cracking out all the correspondence today because it's a special day. We're starting a new album, so let's bring on the Storytime correspondent to talk about this some more. We will be taking today's reading, as always, from The Good Book. This is Paul. Originally, George Martin was the supreme producer in the sky, and we wouldn't even dare ask to go into the control room. But as things loosened up, we got invited in, and George gave us a bit of the control of the tools. He let us have a go. John says, in 1972, you could hear the progression as we learned about recording and the techniques got refined. George Martin says, their ideas
were beginning to become much more potent in the studio, and they would start telling me what they wanted, and they would start pressing me for more ideas and more ways of translating those ideas into reality.
It was Paul, actually, who experimented with his tape machine at home, taking the erase head off and putting on loops. He explained to the other boys how he had done this, and Ringo and George would do the same and bring me different loops of sounds, and I would listen to them at various speeds, backwards, forwards, and select some. My next thought is about how much harder and more musical this album is than Rubber Soul. To be clear, in case the Rubber Soul miniseries was not enough to go on, I don't think that Rubber Soul is lacking in musicality. Rather, I mean that you can hear the Beatles' growth as musicians, development as musicians on this album. We've already touched on what's happening in the bass, but also Ringo's playing beautifully on this. Listen to some of these fills. Get it, Ringo! Ooh, that's a good fill as well. Listen to that. It's punchy, it's clipped, it's tidy. Ringo's not a drummer who really explores fills and really plays around with like solos and that kind of thing, but I believe 1966 for me is the year that Ringo really came into his own as a creative drummer. You can hear it on this track, you can hear it on singles that came out later this year, like Strawberry Fields. Those fills took me a long time to learn. And he says himself that some of his very best drumming is on the track Rain, which was a single that was released just before this album. And in case you don't think that's that impressive, bear in mind that this song was actually recorded way faster and then slowed down. This is what the original recording sounded like. But we're not here to talk about Rain, we're here to talk about Taxman. It's not only the musicians that are playing better. The engineer Geoff Emerick, as a young man, he brought all of this innovation in the style of recording. But over the course of recording this album, even within the first day, Geoff Emerick revolutionized how we record music. Some of those things we discussed earlier, and we will definitely explore in much greater detail over the course of this series. But one of the things that he did is put something soft inside Ringo's bass drum.
That sweater with the 4 holes in, which came from the Help film, I think.
In order to dampen the sound a little bit, and then place the microphone right up against the bass drum, which they were not allowed to do.
I was in trouble. Oh, I could have been fired tomorrow.
He did a very similar thing with the bass, except he'd sort of rigged up a loudspeaker in reverse so that he could use it as a microphone and place that up against the amplifier anyway. All of this to say, it made the rhythm section much bigger and much more prominent.
You get this big boom, which had never been heard before.
And that is one of the things that I think contributes to this being a harder, louder, snarlier, older album than Rubber Soul. It's got a lot more punch, a lot more grit, and a bigger rhythm section. I mean, listen to this. What's really cool about this rhythm section here is that Ringo is doubling Paul's bass part. So if Paul is playing, what Ringo's playing with that is this. He's just playing the kick and the snare. Kick sounds like this, snare sounds like this, and he's playing this. That gives it a real drive. It feels hard. You can feel it in your bones.
Boom.
And what I love about this opening track is it's very similar to Drive My Car. Both have this sort of R&B influence, emphasis on the 2 and 4. I mean, look. Opening Revolver with a song that is so similar to Drive My Car means that the differences become really stark. You can see how they have changed and progressed and matured as musicians, and how their vision has grown. Ugh, love it. And it works because the subject matter is so much heavier and bigger and bolder and more mature, so the music matches that perfectly. A+, Beatles! The last thing I'd like to get into in this video is that this song demonstrates to us as the listeners that the Beatles' minds have been opened. We've already covered the new and exciting ways that the studio was being used, but that carries through into the music. They're doing things that they have never done before. John in 1966 said, "One thing's for sure. The next LP is going to be very different." As Paul McCartney said in 1966, of this album, there are sounds that nobody else has ever done before. I mean nobody. Ever. That's a hell of a statement to make, and granted, Paul McCartney, I think, as a young man, could be quite large-headed, but he's not wrong. As we mentioned in the beginning, these 4 guys had gone away for 3 months on their like Beatles sabbatical. And they had come back with their brains saturated. All of these little things that were now tickling their brains, these new discoveries, they transferred into the music. One of these things that you can hear most obviously is non-Western inflections in the guitar solo. Have a listen in particular to this part of the solo. The open and the close of that solo are pretty standard blues licks. That middle section, what's happening there? Let's ask the piano correspondent. Piano correspondent, what's happening there? I am glad you asked. So, most of this song is in the key of D major. It's a D major group. And most of the solo follows a sort of groovy riff around that chord. Until here. So instead of playing this note, which plays throughout the song, this one, the major 7th it's called, which turns it into this kind of a smush of noise. While the rest of the song sounds like this kind of a smush of noise. It gives it this sort of beautiful, otherworldly quality. And then right at the end, we go back to that kind of bluesy, which is established by this note. Goes back to this note at the end, but there's just a little glimpse of a moment where suddenly we're in a totally different world within this song. As an aside, it sounds ridiculous on piano. Here it is in the context of the recording. Yeah, this is definitely a solo that was built for guitar. I also really love how sloppy the timing is. It's, I shouldn't say sloppy, how loose the timing is. It's very sort of open to interpretation, which again breaks from the sort of metronomic Western music tradition. It's groovy. Very groovy. My favorite little detail about this solo is that it's not played by George Harrison. It's actually played by Paul McCartney. And my understanding is that George Harrison was pretty tickled that Paul had left these little breadcrumbs of Indian music, I suppose, these sort of hints, these whispers at Indian music in his solo because it was George's song. Jeff Emmerich says otherwise, but Jeff Emmerich, the engineer, never has anything nice to say about George Harrison. So we're going to disregard that, and we're going to assume that Paul and George were having a lovely moment, and Paul was paying his respect to George as a songwriter. And honestly, I think that that's entirely probable because they elected for George's song to open the album. He has demonstrated his potential on Rubber Soul, and he has won himself a seat at the table. He gets to open the album. That's great. Well done, George. At least as far as the listeners are concerned. I don't think that his bandmates ever really treated him as anything other than a little brother.
He was always about 9 months older than I. Even now, he's still 9 months older than me.
But yeah, as far as the listeners are concerned, he is, if not an equal, then very, very close to Paul and John as songwriters in the band. So this non-Western music will show up throughout the album. Again, this opener is a teaser to what's coming. And one of the things that's coming on this album is more Indian music. Love it. Give us more. Of course, it would be very remiss of me to not mention the influence of acid. I know that it's sort of a trope about the 60s, and we like to make a joke out of it, but a paper published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology in not 1922, 2022, found that compared to placebo, LSD did the following. Quote, increased novelty, surprise, and originality, and also increased symbolic thinking. I know that anecdotally, as a society, we kind of knew that, but it's currently being legitimized in scientific spheres, so that's cool. But those are all metrics that we use to measure creativity. And nowhere, I think, is that better demonstrated than on this album. John and George go away and do a whole bunch of acid, and then come back to the studio and do things that are unheard of, innovative, novel, exciting, mind-blowing, totally out of left field. I mean, if you look at Rubber Soul, it is a step up musically from Help, but you can see the progression. You can definitely see how some of the songs in Rubber Soul are hangovers from Help. Revolver, on the other hand, is a hard left turn. Like, if you had only ever heard the Beatles' output from 1963 to 1965, I think you would be hard-pressed to predict Revolver. I think the thing that I love most about this album is it's so impressive in its scope and in its vision. This album is monstrous in its ambition. And you could make the same argument for Sgt. Pepper's, but what I think that this album has that Sgt. Pepper's doesn't is a lack of self-consciousness. You know, with Sgt. Pepper's, they were trying to make something lofty and big. With this album, I feel like they were still just making music and just following their noses and seeing where it was going to take them. And they ended up with something revolutionary. There's a charm about that I just can't put into words. I love it. I love this album! So while this song definitely is a nod to their earliest influences with the R&B feel, these new exciting sounds definitely point us in the direction of the innovation that is to come on this album. And that is why I think Taxman is the perfect roadmap to Revolver. To recap, it's got the more mature subject matter. It uses the studio as an instrument in the way that the track is recorded and in the way that they use elements of the song and repeat them later on. It's got the harder sound and the stronger musicality, and it's got genre-defying influences that come in and blindside us. This is gonna be a hell of a ride, people. I love it. And I'm so excited that you're here to come on this adventure with me. Thank you. My question for you this week is this. If you had to choose any other song to open this album other than Taxman, what would be your choice? Why would that be your choice? I'm really looking forward to seeing your answers on this one. I don't know what my answer would be, seeing as you asked. Yeah, not sure. I'd like to know what you think. One last little thing that I find fun about this song, despite everything that I just said about Ringo's musicianship really being elevated on this album, it ends much slower than it begins. Have a listen. Chapter 2, Eleanor Rigby. We will be looking at one of the Beatles' best composed pieces of music ever. There, I said it, let's go. We're listening to Eleanor Rigby. Okay, so this isn't one of my favorite songs to listen to. Like, I don't listen to this because I just really love this song so much, but I do really love this song, and I really respect it for its overall quality. This is a really high caliber song, and today we're gonna break it down into 3 constituent elements: the orchestration, the lyrics, and the melody / song structure. I'm really excited to start with the orchestration. None of the Beatles are playing on this song. 3 of them are singing on it, but nobody from the Beatles is actually playing an instrument on this recording. Everything that is happening behind the vocals was written by George Martin in what I believe to be a stellar piece of composition that displays his understated talent as a writer. This arrangement is raw and it's hard-hitting, but it maintains an elegance throughout. This song alone provides enough evidence for me that George Martin is the fifth Beatle. Like Mal Evans, Brian Epstein, Jeff Emmerich even. They're great, and they're integral to the Beatles' story, but if you're going to nominate a fifth Beatle, in my mind, there is none other than George Martin who could take that spot. So, what's so great about this arrangement, you ask? Now, of course you don't ask. Everyone thinks this is a great arrangement, right? That's the world that I choose to live in. Well, it was inspired by the score from Psycho, which you can hear in these strings here. Lovely. Now, I will concede that this arrangement is not without precedent. Obviously, its predecessor is Yesterday. Which featured, I believe, a string quartet. There are a number of key differences, I think, between Yesterday and Eleanor Rigby. The first is that Paul kind of had to be cajoled into allowing a string quartet on a Beatles recording when they recorded Yesterday, because up until that point, their music was pretty much exclusively performed as a rock and roll lineup with the guitars and the drum and the bass. In the context, other songs that featured strings were really syrupy. Not gritty enough for the Beatles. I guess they sort of felt like they were selling out by including a track on their album that had a heavy string section. By the time Revolver comes around, it's wild to believe it's only been a year, but a lot has happened in that year. One of those things that has happened is that Paul's girlfriend, Jane Asher, has introduced him to Vivaldi. And is taking him to these classical music concerts. So now, Paul McCartney feels like classical music is cultured and that it would be actually kind of a radical move to have strings on your recording. So whereas with Yesterday, George Martin was imploring Paul to put strings on his recording, in this case, Paul is asking George Martin if he'll put something together for this song. And boy does George Martin deliver! So there's a sort of almost a role reversal that's happening there. If you listen to Anthology 2 or the Super Deluxe version of the 2022 release of Revolver, there's a lovely moment right before the beginning of the second instrumental take where George Martin says,
"Stop me if the tempo's not fast enough, Paul."
So George Martin is the person who's on the floor of the studio. Paul is the person who's behind the controls, in the driver's seat, in the control room. And George Martin is taking instruction from Paul. If you had to summarize what it is that makes this song special, I think it's the beautiful relationship between Paul McCartney as a strong songwriter and budding arranger, and his kind of mentor, George Martin, who in a way is having his own creative boundaries pushed by performing with this group of guys who keep demanding things that are seemingly impossible. It's invigorating. Another way that this arrangement is different from Yesterday is that it hits harder. Whereas Yesterday is melancholy and flowing gently, this is rough and raw. We've got short clipped staccato notes like this. It's also mournful like Yesterday, but it's so frantic and so fraught. Part of what makes it that is that Jeff Emmerich, boy wonder, the engineer on this recording session, stuck the microphones right up close against the strings, which he did throughout this album. Like, he had the microphones right up close against the amplifiers. He had them basically in the bells of the brass instruments on we'll get to that, Got to Get You Into My Life. We're not there yet. He did the same thing on this one. So the microphones were right up against the instruments when they were recording this. It's a string octet, so it's basically two string quartets, or one is doubling what the other is doing, which gives it body and texture. So that is a collection of violins, violas, and cellos. And apparently when Jeff Emmerich was setting up the microphones, the string players were sort of scolding him and saying, "You're not meant to do it like that. They're too close to the instruments." They were concerned that they wouldn't be able to play their instruments properly because there was a microphone in the way. So they kept shuffling their chairs backwards. Eventually, George Martin from the control room had to get on this sort of like intercom thing that you used to talk to the people in the studio and tell them, "Stop moving the chairs!" The imagery of this I find so funny. So I think it's time we get into the nitty-gritty and break down why this is so brilliant. The Beatles, most unfortunately, are blockers, which means that I have to be really careful about how much of their songs I feature in the videos. Even though I'm not trying to profit from them, I'm trying to pontificate about how much I love them. Whatever, that's how the music industry in 2024 works. And as I don't want to be hunted down and tried for my Beatle crimes, I've had to recreate the string section. Both instruments are not my strong suit, so it is on guitars instead of cellos, violas, and violins. But I've done my very best to include... Hello, how's it going? I have done my very best to capture all of the elements of the song. Here it is.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Things that I love about this arrangement is that George Martin approaches every verse differently. He never phones it in. He never goes, this is how the arrangement goes, play it through to the rest of the song. He gives every section of the song its due attention and the detail that it requires to help Paul McCartney tell his story. Let's break it down further. Now, because I don't have the same instrumentation as they did, I'm going to speak not in terms of the individual instruments, but in terms of the sort of frequency ranges. So we'll be talking about the lower instruments, the middle instruments, and the high instruments. That's just referring to the frequencies where they sit. High, middle, low. Good. Verse 1 is very straightforward. It's sort of like what the arrangement sounds like at its very simplest. When we listen to it the second time, the middle range instruments double their pace. So if the first time through they're doing this, the second time, they're doing this. In the second verse, the lower instruments get a little moment of showcase right here. The second time, they are joined by a mid-range melody. Very nice. Very tasteful. In the third verse, the middle section instruments get very busy. And above them is this gently flowing high part. And then in the fourth verse, we get this frantic striking. And underneath that, the lower frequency instruments take on the melody in unison with Paul McCartney's vocals. Like this. Like, aren't all of those elements incredible. There's such attention to detail here. This is what I mean when I say that he's never phoning it in. He's giving each of these moments in the song a little bit to set them apart from all of the others. There's hardly any repetition. And in that, it is stunning on its own, but it never steps on Paul McCartney's vocals. For instance, almost all of the melodic runs in these string parts respond to the vocal parts. I'll show you what I mean. Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and John Lennon sing "ah," and once they've established that, the lower instruments step up, and then our three singers sing "look at all the lonely people," and once they've finished that, the bass steps down, like so. So that bum 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 never sits on top of the vocal, because if you put them on top of each other, each would pull focus from the other. And then this very distinctive, very recognizable melody line played on, I believe, the violins. That's happening when nobody is singing. There is space for the string section to get really busy because nothing else is happening. As soon as Paul starts singing the verse, everyone falls back into formation. None of the instruments are getting too big for their boots. No singing? Vocals. See how these accents happen as soon as Paul McCartney takes a break. So there's always something interesting for us to listen to, but never coinciding in a way that's unpleasant to listen to. Oh, lovely. Or there's a melody run somewhere around the middle of the song that goes do 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 do. It catches all of the high notes of the melody and they coincide at the same time, so it's sort of riding on the back of the vocals, even harmonizing with the vocals. Let's listen. So those are all points where the vocals are being accentuated anyway. Socks in the night when there's nobody there. We get it a little later in the song as well, like this. The string arrangement is picking up those accents and highlighting them, augmenting them even. And then my last example, of course, is this. In the final verse, when the bottom instruments pick up the melody and play in unison with Paul McCartney's melody, like this. And that do-do-do-do, the little busy part there happens before he starts singing, and then as soon as he starts singing, the bass does something a little bit more sedate. It's genius arranging. Just stunning. Such good work. And then on top of that, it sounds great. It's not just the cleverness of it. It is so pleasant to listen to. So affecting. So moving. It's beautiful in its own right. Each little part is slightly different so that it draws and holds your attention so that Paul McCartney can tell his beautiful story. It is such a beautiful collaboration between two incredibly creative people. I genuinely think that this is one of George Martin's most impressive contributions to any Beatles song. Hats off to you, my friend. Let's dig into the lyrics. Generally, I feel that Paul McCartney is a weaker lyricist than John Lennon. I have stated this in the past, and it stirred up a lot of controversy, but I am standing by what I said. And I would once again like to submit Exhibit A as evidence to my case.
Well, something took a hold of me, and I acted like a dustbin lid.
What does that even mean? What are you trying to communicate, man? Having said that, I think that Eleanor Rigby is one of his best efforts. Again, ever, in any song that he's written. This man has written a lot of songs, and this, I think, is one of his best lyrical efforts. It depicts a rich story of two people living lives of quiet, bleak isolation. More importantly, though, it shows rather than tells, and I think that that is the mark of a good lyricist. The song is heavy on imagery. Apparently that's how this started for Paul McCartney. The idea of picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been. That doesn't say this person is lonely, although we do get to that in the chorus. It says, this is someone who never gets to attend the wedding. She just cleans up after them by herself. Or Father Mackenzie, darning his socks in the night when there's nobody there. Even the way that the vocals are inflected, they're so emphatic. He's darning his socks in the night when there's nobody there. It's almost conversational, but it is so much more musical than that at the same time. Genius. Or even the idea that Father Mackenzie is writing his sermon and no one's gonna listen to it. I think maybe that's the most tragic thing about it. In theory, I think churches are meant to be about community, and here is this man who leads, presumably, a congregation, except it's empty and there's no one there. So not only is he doing all of this by himself, he's doing it for no one. Again, I think that the best lyrics evoke. They don't tell us overtly, there's this woman and she lives by herself and she's super lonely and nothing interesting happens to her. Also, there's this man, he also lives by himself, nothing much is happening in his life. They don't need to tell us that because all of these peripheral details of their life come together and show us. Now, I must say, I have said that this is one of Paul's best lyrical efforts, but apparently this was a very collaboratively written song, with each Beatle contributing some element of the lyrics. An element I like about the lyrics is how Paul McCartney has deliberately chosen plain names. He speaks to this in Anthology, so I think it's time for us to pay a visit to the Storytime correspondent. Over to you, my friend. Hello there. As always, we will be taking today's reading from The Good Book. Paul says, I had a bit of trouble with the name, and I'm always keen to get a name that sounds right. Looking at my old school photographs, I remembered the names, and they all work. James Stringfellow, Grace Pendleton, whereas when you read novels, it's all James Turnberry, and it's not real. So I was very keen to get a real sounding name for the tune and the whole idea. I also like the idea that they are separate but tangentially related characters whose orbits almost come into contact with each other, but they kind of miss each other. So you have these two very separately lonely people, and they really only come together explicitly when Father Mackenzie is... It is an interestingly bleak ending to the song. Nobody gets their redemption, nobody makes any friends. They just die. And there's no one at the funeral, and there's no one in the church. The end. Again, much like Taxman, this is definitely not a love song. It is not even close to a love song. It is, I mean, you could argue that it's an absence of love song, but no, it's not a love song at all. That's something that I find really engaging and interesting about this song. I think it's time for us to talk about the melody of this song. This is a song that has a handsome, poignant melody. It's good. Here's how I usually judge the quality of a melody. Bear in mind, this does not mean that I'm judging the quality of the song specifically, but I think that a song has an engaging and interesting melody when it can stand on its own without lyrics, when you can play it instrumentally and it still sounds really good. I think this song meets that criterion. Let's put it to the piano correspondent to prove that theory. Yes, let's test that theory. That sounds pretty good without vocals. An example of a song that doesn't necessarily translate as well melodically to an instrumental version is I Am the Walrus.
Editor's note. Having said that, jazz pianist Brad Meldau does a cover of I Am the Walrus that I think is one of the best covers that anybody has ever done of a Beatles song. So you can make music out of anything, really. And don't get me wrong, I am not saying that I Am the Walrus doesn't have its merits. Indeed, I think it might be one of John Lennon's top 5 vocal performances, personally, but it doesn't have the melodic prowess, or finesse maybe, that Eleanor Rigby does. I mean, it's so sweet. I'm gonna sit here and play that a few more times and let you get back to the show. It's an odd structure because it has this refrain that is neither a verse nor a chorus. It opens with it, it closes with it. It's like the song's bookend. It's separate from the other parts of the song, and it works. It still works really well. I especially love that they bring that back at the end so that it acts as a counterpoint to the melody of the chorus. Paul sings that top note so beautifully and so clearly. You really hear the sweetness to his voice. Something about the way that they have brought that back in makes it feel so much more vulnerable and lonely, because all of the other times in the song, that's sung by 3 people. I think this is a clever bit of arrangement, because when they're singing about all the lonely people, there's a small group of them. But when Paul is singing specifically about the individual characters of the song, it's not even double-tracked. It's just his voice on its own. And then at the very end, when they bring that refrain back, that is usually sung by the 3, it's just Paul on his own. And it makes it so much more melancholy and mournful. That's basically everything I had to say about the song. There is one last point, which is that Paul was certain that he had gotten the name Eleanor Rigby from a combination of Eleanor Braun, who I think was the lead actress in the Help movie, and the name Rigby, which he had seen on a storefront in Bristol. Bristol? Brighton? Somewhere in Britain. And he thought, that's a good name, I'll put those together. However, Paul McCartney first saw John Lennon perform at St. Peter's Church in Woolton Village. Behind the church is a cemetery, and in that cemetery is a grave for a woman named Eleanor Rigby. Paul McCartney says, "It was either complete coincidence or in my subconscious. I suppose it was more likely in my subconscious because I will have been amongst those graves knocking around with John and wandering through there. It was the sort of place we used to sunbathe." Is that what they were doing? Cutting school. Or as we call it in New Zealand, wagging. Wagging school. Coincidence is just a word that says 2 things coincided, but as to why they happened together, there are probably far deeper reasons than our little brains can grasp. And not too far from Eleanor Rigby's grave is a grave for a John Mackenzie. And that little detail makes the last line of the song, wiping the dirt from his hands as he walked from her grave, all the more poignant. So I guess the question is it a really, really bizarre coincidence? Or was that just buried deep within Paul McCartney's subconscious and it resurfaced in his brain in early 1966? Who knows? So let's conclude. Eleanor Rigby is a song that is unabashedly poignant, it is expertly melodic, and it is a collaborative effort not only between the 4 Beatles, but also between Paul McCartney and George Martin. It is one of the band's most beautiful and heart-rending songs in their entire extensive catalogue, in my opinion. So my question for you this week is, do you agree with that? And if you don't, what song do you think fits the bill? Chapter 3. I'm only sleeping. Track 3, side 1, I'm only sleeping. Yes! We're gonna do things a little bit differently around here today because I have a question that I would like answered. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna lay out the arguments, and then while you're thinking about your answer, I'm going to talk about music a little bit, specifically what it is that they are doing musically to make the song sound sleepy, and then we'll wrap up, and ideally you will tell me what you think the answer is. Are we following? Good. Okay, here's the question. Is I'm Only Sleeping an existential lament about the crushing weight of being alive, or is it literally just a song about the merits of a good nap? Let's begin. 1. Existential woe. Let's paint a picture. You're John Lennon. It's 1966. For the past 3 years, you have kept up relentless touring. Press conferences.
How did the Ringo come about?
Because I wear 4 rings.
Fair enough, yes.
Quick, I'm not called Ringo.
No, I can see that. I hope the camera can.
It's called Hando.
Gig after gig after gig, before an audience of people screaming their lungs out at you.
Shut up, Polly's talking!
You've been expected to put out 2 albums a year, and you have delivered, and you have filmed and released and done the press circuit for 2 films.
It's been a hard day's night. Help me if you can.
And that's not even counting before that, where you were slogging it because you were trying to make it as a musician in Liverpool and around the north of England.
or even before that in Hamburg, where you're playing 5 to 8 hours a night. The longest regular gig that I've ever played was 4 hours every Friday, and that took quite a lot out of me. Granted, I was not drugged up to my eyeballs on Brilliant. Maybe that was my failing. I just wanted to take a minute also to explain why it is that touring is so tiring, because you'd think it's just being on planes and then sitting in hotels and then playing gigs and there's heaps of downtime. But the thing is that the transport itself is quite tiring, spending hours on planes, the jet lag, airports, if you've ever been on a plane, you know it really takes it out of you. Then you have interviews to do, you have press to deal with, you have to be on, you have to be in like charismatic mode, funny and charming. That's tiring. And then if you have any downtime, it's not in your own home, you're not surrounded by your things, you're in another hotel room. When you go to bed that night, you're not sleeping in your own bed, you're sleeping in a hotel bed. And that's not even getting to the gig. Gigs are really tiring. You were just laying yourself bare for an enormous audience. If these guys were playing to enormous crowds, we weren't playing to crowds quite that big. But the adrenaline of it, the being on stage, the performing, the again having to summon the energy to be really charismatic and engaging and fun to watch, and then just the offense of roaring, the sheer amount of noise. All of that is draining. When my band went on tour for our first album, I really thought it was going to be like a holiday with my two best friends. We were going to go on a road trip, we were going to get to play music, but a lot of the interviews that we had to do were really early in the morning. And then you've got a solid block of several hours, but you can't really go anywhere too far or do anything that's going to be too energy sapping. You've got to do your pack-in, your sound check, then the gig itself, and then you go to sleep in a hotel room. There's a lot about touring that takes it out of you.
Touring was a drag, madness from morning till night with not one moment's peace. Living with each other in a room for 4 years on tour. We toured like for 4 years. Of course there were great moments. Whenever we talk about it, it's all laughs. Half the time we just mime on the mic because your voice had gone or anything like that. The kids would just be howling.
More broadly, in the Western world, the UK has a general election. It has just been announced in the States that the number of troops being sent to Vietnam is going to be substantially increased. In response to that, there has been an increased number of public demonstrations against the war. The civil rights movement is well underway. Martin Luther King himself is speaking out publicly against the Vietnam War. We've had our first controlled moon landing, and critically, the FIFA World Cup trophy was stolen. Fortunately, it was recovered by a dog named Pickles. Good boy, Pickles. And of course, on March 4th, there is an interview that Maureen Cleave has done with John Lennon that is published, in which he says that the Beatles are more popular than Jesus, and I'm sure that that won't come back to bite him in the ass.
Hurricanes hitting, race riots, student
Wings on
riots.
fire.
There was always something that we pulled into town. There was always some big thing going on, and we'd come in the middle with this mania, and it'd just be like chaos.
Basically, early 1966 John Lennon is tired. I think it is telling that right after the release of this album, and at the conclusion of a truly horrific tour in which they were chased out of the Philippines.
Did you get kicked in? No, I was very delicate and moved every time they touched me.
And they received death threats in the States.
We have ways and means to stop this if this is going to be the case, yeah.
Because it turns out that interview didn't really pan out so well for John Lennon. People were burning their records. In an interview, Ringo said that when they were playing their final gigs in the States, he was playing with his cymbals tilted up a little bit because he was worried about being shot. Fortunately, he was not shot. Unfortunately, another Beatle was later shot in the States. Now I've bummed myself out. So yeah, I think it's telling that they release this album, they go on their tour, and they go, that's it, I'm done. That's enough. John Lennon has said of the song Help that as he was writing it, he didn't realize that it was like a subconscious cry for help. And he released it and went, I guess I did need help. So maybe this song is a similar case where he thinks he's just writing a song about being tired, but maybe this was his subconscious telling him, you're too tired, you're doing too much, slow down. And you know, if your subconscious tells you that, it's probably a good idea to listen. I suppose in this case, it did. I first encountered this album when I was about 6 years old. It was copied for me onto a cassette tape by a family friend. Shout out Gail and Tom.
You changed my life. I really loved this one. I thought the backing vocals were just stunning. We'll get into that. I'm very, very fond of this song. And I was especially fond of it as a 6-year-old, I think because the subject matter was really relatable. I also enjoyed sleeping as a 6-year-old. As an adult, with Bills, who is subject to the relentless onslaught of information by way of the World Wide Web, I also find this song incredibly relatable, but for totally different reasons than I did when I was 6. I feel that this song does speak to the exhaustion of being an adult human being with responsibilities in a world that feels like it's going crazy. Let's examine some lyrical evidence. There are a couple of lines in particular in this song that feel very evasive, very escapist. It's like the 1966 equivalent of, I'm taking a social media break at the moment. I'll show you what I mean. Stay in bed, float upstream, please don't wait. Stay in bed, float upstream. You're sort of disappearing into your own mindscape, leaving everything else behind. Don't wake me, just leave me alone. I don't need to engage with everything. It is exhausting. There's also a lot about this song that in that vein feels like he is deliberately divorcing himself from the rat race and from all of the other people running around. Observe. Please. I don't mind, I think they're crazy, running everywhere at such a speed. I don't mind, I think they're crazy, running everywhere at such a speed. So he has separated himself from the furor of society, of all of the wild events that are taking place. Maybe he's just taking a moment and giving himself a little breathing room. In that sense, I think that there is also kind of a philosophical bent to this song. A la Tomorrow Never Knows. There are a lot of similarities, I think, with that song, specifically in the references to floating upstream. In this case, he is floating upstream. Float upstream. As opposed to in Tomorrow Never Knows, where he is floating downstream. Float downstream. Which begs the question, how do you float upstream? That would be swimming. Let's not read too much into it. Now, I find that especially in this line here. Till they find there's no need. There's this real sense of all of it is a construct, all of it is an illusion. You can separate yourself from it. Nothing is real. I think that theme seems to show up in a lot of John Lennon's lyrics. Don't get too attached to things because none of it is real. We're living in a simulation! John Lennon, 1966. And again, I really relate to that as an adult person living in 2024 because there is so much going on. There has been so much going on of late. We have so much access to all of the information about all of those goings on. Without becoming too down, everything is really expensive. We're having to work harder, and a lot of the safety nets that were designed to protect us from falling through the cracks are sort of being slowly eroded. There's nothing to catch a lot of us if we fall. Now, I know that that's quite heavy, but when I listen to that song as an adult, that's kind of what I hear, and there is something very seductive about the idea of just taking a minute, lying there and staring at the ceiling, falling into a sleepy, meditative state, going with the flow. And in a sense, I do think that there is some merit to doing that sometimes for the sake of your mental health. We can't carry everything that's happening all the time. It's a lot. So there we have it. That's argument one. This song is about the existential burden that we all carry as part of the human condition. Argument one. Argument two. The song is about sleeping. I think it is a well-established fact that John Lennon was a slothful man. Is that a word? Let's check. Good, that is a word. I remember reading a story in Mark Lewison's Tune-In, and I cannot find it on the internet, so if anybody has a copy of that book and can back it up, please post it in the comments. I may even pin it. If I can remember it correctly, John Lennon, as a young man in Liverpool, got a job as a luggage handler at Liverpool Airport because Aunt Mimi decided if you cannot follow the straight and narrow in an academic context, then you need to go out and get yourself a job. He lasted, I think, a matter of days. He decided that it was not for him. It was very tedious and very tiring and too much commute time. Boy, I wish we all had the privilege to just go, forget the 9 to 5. I'm gonna become a rock musician, and for that to actually work out. No, of course I'm not talking about me. Ironically, assuming I have the story correct, they named that airport after him. I'd like to think that he would find that funny now. They probably did it while he was alive, who knows? I could, but I don't want to look it up right now. The man loved to sleep, which is fair because sleep is delightful. Maureen Cleave wrote in that interview that I referenced earlier, "He can sleep almost indefinitely, is probably the laziest person in England." John Lennon says, I quote, "Physically lazy. I don't mind writing or reading or watching or speaking, but sex is the only physical thing I can be bothered with anymore." So when he's not at work as a Beatle, he's lying down. He's sleeping. And again, as somebody who loves a good nap, there's also a solid argument. I think as Beatles fans, we can sometimes have a tendency to read too much into Beatles lyrics. So maybe they just needed material and he was just phoning it in and writing a song about how nice sleep is. And if this is what it looks like when John Lennon is phoning it in, I'll take it. As stated earlier, I love this song. Right. While you meditate on those two arguments, let's talk about some music. One of the most brilliant things about this seemingly very simple song is that it feels sleepy, very lethargic and dopey. And here are some of the ways that I think they achieve that. The first is that the beat is almost very slightly late. That's not to say that Ringo is not playing in time, but rather that in music, you can play right on the beat, or you can play just behind it. It takes a lot of skill and control to do that well, because if you leave it too long, then it sounds like you're playing out of time. But there's this sweet spot that you can find where it sounds just right, where it's got a little groove to it. I'll see if I can find an example on the vocals. Just a moment. Please don't wake me, no, don't shake me, leave me where I am. It's slow, it's sluggish, it's kind of lazy. He's slurring the way he's speaking as well. When I wake up early in the morning, it sounds like he's just woken up early in the morning. And apparently he never woke up early in the morning. Apparently he was very good at sleeping in and Paul used to have to wake him up, which is right on brand. We've got our sleepy sound effects. Apparently just before that you can hear John say, "Yawn, Paul," but I haven't been able to hear it. The song has this heavy, plodding bass. We've sort of covered how Jeff Emmerich achieved the heavy bass sound, and that is by very illegally at Abbey Road Studios in 1966, putting a microphone right up against the bass amplifier. Big no-no, big yes yes. It's got this almost muffled tone to it. It's languorous. I was thinking about this morning. It's really difficult to describe. The tone sounds round as opposed to sharp. I don't know if that means anything to you, but I think that's the perfect definition. And then there's the bass line itself, which sounds like it's dragging its feet. Let's get the bass correspondent in to demonstrate. Now I can't move on from the bass in this song without mentioning this beautiful riff that was featured in my top 50 Paul McCartney bass lines video. Check out this glorious thing. An earlier take had vibraphone as one of the lead instruments, which I think is a pretty sleepy instrument. That take sounded a little bit like this. I quite like the lineup that they did decide to go with, but in case you're curious, here's what it would have sounded like if they had gone with that sort of vibraphone sound. I'm only sleeping. Pretty sleepy. And perhaps most importantly, we've got this very dreamy, surrealistic, reversed guitar solo. What's really cool about this solo is that George Harrison wrote it backwards so that it would sound good when you played it forwards and the guitar was reversed. I hope that makes sense. What I mean is, if this is the chord sequence for this section of the song, here's what that chord sequence sounds like in reverse.
Harrison wrote a solo to that second chord sequence, so that when he recorded it against that chord sequence, they could flip it, and it wouldn't sound like he was playing over the wrong chords. Here's what the solo sounded like before it was reversed. This was a revolutionary choice, because as far as I'm aware, it was the first time that this technological choice was used in popular music. Of course, they also used it on Rain. It was pretty influential. You can hear a lot of their contemporaries doing this after this album was released, like Crosby, Stills and Nash did it on Pre-Road Downs from their 1969 eponymous debut, which we have covered on this channel gleefully. Now, I think it's really cool the way that George Harrison did this, and I think that the solo works really beautifully. But, true to form, Jeff Emmerich had some not so charitable things to say about it. Let's go to our Storytime correspondent who will tell us more.
Hi there. We're coming to you from outside today because the weather is nice and the film space is currently being used for a very boring corporate work meeting. Boo! Which I suppose is exactly the kind of thing that John Lennon would rather be asleep for. We'll be taking today's reading from Here, There and Everywhere, My Life Recording the Music of the Beatles by Jeff Emmerich. This one's a doozy. Some days, of course, were better than others. There was one especially tedious session where we all wished we had never come up with the concept of backwards sounds. The song was I'm Only Sleeping, and George Harrison was determined to play a backwards guitar solo on it. At the best of times, he had trouble playing solos all the way through forwards. So it was with great trepidation that we all settled in for what turned out to be an interminable day of listening to the same 8 bars played backwards over and over again. The shade!
Genuinely, what did that man have against George Harrison? I think it's interesting that it sounds a little bit like the Taxman solo, even though the Taxman solo is played forwards and this is played backwards. It's also similar in that the Taxman solo closes out the song, like this. Compare that against this. I love that. Out of interest, here's what that sounds like played forwards. We've got our beautiful, soothing, calming vocals, which for me make the whole song, specifically this one. Ah, I love that. And while we're on the subject of harmonies, who could forget all the world going by my window? Oh, good work, Paul. Good work. The last thing that I would say about the music in this song is that it feels like it ends in an unresolved place. To be clear, I don't mean it's musically unresolved, because it does return to the root. It's soothing and it's calming and reassuring, but it ends here. That doesn't sound like the way that you would end a peaceful meditation on the bliss of sleeping, which leads me to think that maybe this song is about something heavier, but again, I'll leave that to you to decide. I'm not going to step all over your decision-making process. Before we close out the episode, there's one last thing that I would like to mention, and that is that the music video for the song won a Grammy last month. The video was by an artist named M. Cooper, who painted over 1,300 oil paintings to put together the music video.
The film is made up of individual oil paintings. I'm literally painting a frame, I take a shot, and then I usually just wipe it and repaint, and the next frame, and the next frame, and the next frame. It's really old school, it's just frame by frame.
And here's a little bit of what the video itself looks like. Please don't spoil my day. Truly, it is a beautiful piece of work, and it covers so many different periods of John Lennon's life.
I worked really closely with the archivist from Apple Corps, who really helped me find the right pieces of archive footage of the Beatles.
Interestingly to me, this M. Cooper artist person also seems to be of a mind that the song is about something heavier than just sleep.
It feels kind of like a defiant position against the kind of capitalist view of time. You know, we must get everything done. It's almost like Lennon saying, like, you know, I'm not hurting anyone by sleeping.
Preach, M.
Chapter 4. Love You To.
This is probably the most excited I've been to record an episode, not specifically because the song that we're going to be doing today is one of my favorite Beatles songs. It's just that this one's gonna be so cool, you guys. Let's get stuck in. Now, this is a song that often gets overlooked within the album, within the Beatles canon. I think that that is a critical error, and I'm gonna spend the next 25 to 30 minutes trying to convince you of that, roughly speaking. Let's start by catching up on what George Harrison has been up to in the 6 months leading to the recording of this piece. Where we left off with Revolver, he had been introduced to the sitar in a number of ways sort of at the same time. The first was on the set of the movie Help, where there's a group of musicians who are playing in the back of one of the scenes, and he looked at the sitar and went, wow, that's a cool instrument. Another was David Crosby of the Byrds, my king, introduced him to Ravi Shankar and his music. And it all sort of coalesced, and George bought himself a sitar and first played it on Norwegian wood. Beatles go on tour, and then they have their 3-month sort of Beatles sabbatical at the beginning of 1966. A couple of episodes ago we covered how Paul was spending that time going to pretentious classical music concerts. One episode ago we covered that John spent that time catching up on some sleep, and George spent that 3 months consuming Indian music. George was obsessed. Here are some of the comments he made about Indian music during that period. Over to you, Storytime correspondent. This quote is from George Harrison in the year of our good Lord, 1966. He's speaking on the subject of Indian music. To me, it is the only really great music now, and it makes Western 3 or 4 beat type stuff seem somehow dead. You can get so much more out of it if you're prepared really to concentrate and listen. I hope more people will try to dig it. He's listening to it at home, he's attending concerts, he's taking lessons, he's playing with classical Indian music players. Up until this point, you could make the argument that George was sort of this secondary or even maybe tertiary songwriting member of the band. He had obviously proved his worth on Rubber Soul with songs like If I Needed Someone. If I needed someone. And Think for Yourself. But in April of 1966, George Harrison did something revolutionary and unprecedented. He successfully fused 2 completely disparate musical traditions on a pop record, and he managed to do so, I think, authentically, steering clear of appropriation. I'm of the opinion that this was an incredible feat, and we're gonna get into why right now. I'd like to think that I know Western popular music, particularly of this vintage, like the back of my hand. But the same is definitely not true of Indian music. For this reason, I have sent out our field reporter to speak with someone who can help me out. Cherished viewers, I'm very pleased to introduce today's special guest, Shalu. I have known Shalu for nearly 10 years now, and for about 7 of those years, she has been a dedicated student of the sitar. Welcome, Shalu. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for including me in this.
Shalu is going to walk us through the basics, and then she is going to have a listen to this song and tell us what she thinks. I think that Indian classical music can be a little bit tricky for Western listeners to get our heads around, because that sort of very broad musical tradition features a whole lot of elements that don't have equivalents in Western music. But if our George can do it, we can do it too. Let's go. When I say that there's no Western equivalent, a really good example of that is the Indian raga. Now, I'm certain this is going to be imperfect. Please know that I'm doing my best, and if you have any corrections, let me know and pop them in the comments. I will be totally fine with that. So in Indian classical music, the raga is sort of like a foundation or a framework. The closest thing that we have in Western music to the concept of a raga is a scale or a mode. And to really oversimplify, it's basically a constellation of notes that evoke a specific mood or a vibe, and as far as I can understand it, the word itself literally translates to tone or hue or color. So we can say that something similar exists in Western music, because scales and modes and all of that technical stuff basically also translate to constellations of notes that evoke a mood. Let's get the piano correspondent to just very quickly show us some examples of what I mean by that.
Hello! I'm not going to get too deeply into scales and modes because there are a lot of other channels on YouTube that will do that more technically and accurately than I'm going to. But roughly, a major scale might look like this. A minor scale might look like this. Modes are kind of like taking a scale and then changing the order around a bit to create a totally different mood. So I'm not going to play all of them, but to give you an example, here are the 4 whose names I like best. E Phrygian, so called because it starts on E. B Locrian, so called because it starts on B. Eerie, unsettling, creepy. F Lydian. My favorite mode personally. And D Dorian. Incidentally, Eleanor Rigby is an example of a song that's played in Dorian mode, which gives you a good sense of how a song's mode or a song's scale can generate a feel. You can imagine how Eleanor Rigby makes you feel, and you can see how each of these has a different kind of color or mood that goes with them. I would argue that the same is true of Indian ragas. Here are some ragas as examples. I'm gonna do my very best to pronounce these correctly. Mohanam. Hamsadwani. This one's tricky. Maya Malvagola. I hope I've got that right. I like that one. That one's cool. Hindolam. So you can see what I mean. Each of those has an accompanying color, mood, feel, hue, tone. They're similar to scales and modes, but not exactly the same. The concept is slightly, subtly different. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, piano correspondent. Are we still following? That's great, because this stuff is awesome. I think a good place to get stuck in here is at the nexus of George Harrison's interest in Indian music, the sitar. Here's a little bit about how it's made and what it looks like and all of the noises it makes.
So this is your sitar?
Sitar, yes. That's what it is.
How does this work?
That's a handmade instrument. 100% handmade instrument.
Beautiful.
Would you have any idea from what this is called a tumba?
Is it a gourd?
It is a gourd, you're right. It's a particular kind of pumpkin.
Okay.
You've got 2 sets of strings on it. So that's your sympathetic strings underneath. It could be anything between 11 to 13 strings there. And usually when anybody's playing, they would go through them once or twice because they're tuned on the scale that you're playing, so it's quite a nice effect.
It's beautiful, yeah. My understanding when you say sympathetic strings is that you play your melodies on the main strings.
Yes.
And the strings on the bottom vibrate with sympathy.
Yes, they will resonate. If they are in perfect sync with your main strings and the frets, you get a lingering echo.
Let's pause there for a second so that I can demonstrate what is meant by vibrating in sympathy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sing this note and I'm not going to play any of the strings. Watch. Ah. Let's try a different note. Ah. Do you hear it coming through the amplifier? That's because my voice producing that sound has caused this string to vibrate independently of me touching it. So that's what's happening with the sympathetic strings on the sitar. You're playing notes on the main string that are sort of catching the sympathetic strings and causing them to vibrate independently, just like this setup. An interesting Beatle fact, I think it's interesting anyway, that's exactly how the introduction to I Feel Fine is played. It was sort of discovered by accident because John had left his electric guitar during a recording session, leaning up against the amplifier. Paul played an A note on his bass, and it caused the A string on the guitar to vibrate in sympathy, which was picked up by the amplifier, which is what makes that sort of a sound. And sitar strings make sort of a similar sound, a sort of that's, yeah, strings vibrating in sympathy. on with the show.
And on the top, a lot of serious professional players, they will have 7 strings, but at my level, I don't need it.
Right.
Yes, I've got these 6 strings.
Because there are so many strings on this instrument, it's also tuned in a very specific way. Similar and yet entirely different to guitar strings.
I will tune these sympathetic strings through these little pegs. Then we come to these main strings. And to tune the top strings, we use these 6 knobs to tune this. And these 2 little bits, this is to the very fine tuning for these main strings. You just slide them up and down. They need to be tuned properly, and then you get a full-bodied sound out of that.
I see.
So we've done these 2 tunings, and then we check all these frets made of graphite.
Okay.
Because graphite is quite hard, but yet quite light.
And they move, is that right?
Yes, you can move them. Like today I've started with another rag where I needed to move this fret. So I can just slide it up and down.
Right.
That's how you start playing. Mm-hmm.
Have I understood correctly that with like a guitar, the tuning is relatively fixed? You can change the tuning, but generally you're learning to play songs around a fixed tuning, whereas within this instrument, you're playing an entire piece within a sort of set of scales or modes?
Yes, because the different rags will have different scales. Mm-hmm. Depending on the rag you're playing and the scale which is different, you will adjust 2-3 strings on the sympathetic ones, because the resonance of those notes will come through when I'm playing through my rag.
Right. I think a very distinctive sound in sitar music is the sort of bent pitches. Like you can hear it in the central riff of this song, right here. So that is a bend. It's starting do and going up to do, 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 do. So that's sort of a really distinctive sound that I think a lot of us can identify in sitar music, and this is how it's done. When you're playing on a fret,
yes,
a lot of the melody is bent, right?
If I'm playing a straight note, say I'm going, that's straight.
Yep.
But when you pull the string, by bend you mean pulling the string?
Yes, yeah.
So from the same fret, I can get sounds up to...
You're going up by about a tone.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
See now, because I was on the right note, so you get that echo, that is because it's tuned nicely and I got to the right note.
Right.
So you hear that resonance as well.
So you're doing that by ear?
Yes. Yes. The pulling is called mead.
Mead.
And in the language it's called mead because you're pulling the string to get different notes from the same place.
Right.
Yeah.
The reason I said bend is that that's what you say when you're talking about guitars. You bend the string. So it's interesting. There are some parallels, but they're also obviously very different instruments. Let's say you wanted to play A. Mm-hmm. There would be many different ways that you could play that, given the fretting and the pulling.
Yes.
How do you decide which to use?
When you pull the string, the melody you get from that is much more beautiful than when you play it on the strings.
I see.
Say I'm going to F from here. Now I'll do it from here. You get a little reflection of all the other notes in between.
Right, you're catching the overtones.
You're catching a little bit of the other notes.
So it's similar to bending notes on guitar, but again, much more pronounced. It's a much more dramatic effect. More notes. I think the last key element that's going to sort of help us appreciate this incredible song is the way that musical pieces are structured in Indian classical music.
You start from a very, very slow tempo without the percussion.
Is that improvised? Sorry.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It is improvised. Slowly build it up, the percussionist joins in, and then you build up the tempo slowly, a little bit more, and then you finish on the highest tempo.
And we've really just scratched the surface here, but that's a very broad idea of what George was spending his time filling his brain with in the 6 months prior to the recording of this, and specifically in that sort of 3-month Beatle holiday. All of this, to us it might sound like a cool song with exotic sounds, but actually there's a rich and complex history behind everything that he's doing on this track. How cool is that? So at this point I played the song to Shalu and asked her what she thought, as somebody who's just dedicated the last 7 years of her life to really getting to know this instrument and this music generally. And here's what she said. Have you heard the song Love You Too by the Beatles before?
I've listened to it not many times, but yes.
Great.
I have.
What I'd like to do is have a listen to the song together, and then I've got some questions.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
That's right. Sympathetic strings going.
Great.
Very interesting, yeah.
So I suppose my first question is, what elements of that song jump out to you as originating in Indian classical music as opposed to rock and roll?
A couple of them straight away, even just the very initial part when we're starting this, they're running right through the sympathetic string, which is a very prevalent way when you start any classical piece in Indian classical music.
Sure.
So that's one thing, and even the pulling of the string, the meend. Those are very typical things you would use in any classical piece, and even the pace, the way the tempo of the whole song is going, and in the end you just pick up the tempo.
Right. And the beginning that's quite slow.
Yes, beginning is quite soft, so you gently start your piece. And then you're bringing that tempo from very soft to you kind of elevate it and bring it up.
Right.
So that's how it goes.
The beginning section is he's not playing to a fixed rhythm, is he?
No. Right. The very beginning is kind of like a freelance, you could say. Initially it's very soft and without much set rhythm, and then you bring everything in.
Right.
Yeah.
What about the vocals? Is there anything about the vocal that you feel sort of draws from Indian music?
I have to admit that I was more focusing on the instrumental side of it than the vocals.
That's absolutely fine. I suppose
My apologies for that.
No, that's fine. But I have heard it said that the na 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 na. Just going to interrupt for a second. That little vocal riff that he's doing there is sort of distinctly non-Western. It sounds like, but with this sort of drone in the bass. I'll see if the piano correspondent can explain it better. This harmony is one of my favorite parts of the song. It goes like this. As far as I can understand it, both vocal parts start on C, one of them stays there, and the other goes. Except with sort of like a trill. That means that second harmony lands here, creating... That is just delectable. I love that sound. Now the harmony that Paul McCartney wanted to do in this demo sounds like this.
But what you got means such a lot to me.
And this note here confirms that it's a minor feel, as opposed to a major feel. That one note, it locks it into this very specific feel that I feel the song doesn't otherwise have. And that little element of mystery, I think, is what makes it so delicious. If they're singing, that could be minor, or it could be major. But they're not telling us, so we get to sort of play around with that in our heads. And that ambiguity, I think, is much sexier than just a straight minor or major. It's this. Pretty nice. This is what his playing sounded like 6 months earlier.
Before this song.
Yeah. That's 6 months earlier. How would you judge his playing
Me judging his playing.
Yes.
Oh my god, that's a tough one. If that is 6 months, that's huge difference.
Huge improvement?
Huge difference.
Right.
Because pulling of the string, that doesn't come overnight at all, trust me.
Right.
It takes a long time.
Right.
It does take a long time. Like if you would not have said 6 months, I would easily give it much bigger number.
Right.
Yeah, so that's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing to me. Yeah.
So when you listen to it, you don't think, oh, that sounds terrible.
No, not at all.
Okay.
Not at all.
Great. Well done, George.
We'll get some more of her thoughts on this song a little bit later in the episode. Now I'd like to get into what George is bringing to the song from his own musical upbringing. The first is that there's sort of this fuzzy guitar happening in the background. It's a little bit difficult to hear because the other instruments on this track are tabla and tambura. And Ringo on the tambourine. I think you can hear it best here. In the background. This song doesn't have any bass in it, so that sort of gives it almost a bass part. It changes the root chord from ah to ah very briefly, which catches our attention. It's very unusual in a British or an American piece of music for the entire song to stay on the same chord throughout. It's why Tomorrow Never Knows was also so groundbreaking, that basically the only other example that comes to mind for me is Give It Away by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Give it away, give it away, give it away now. With the exception of the guitar solo, it stays in the same key. I don't know if I'll be able to do this, but I'll give it a shot. Just for funsies, here's what the Beatles' Love You To sounds like on top of Give It Away by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Because that's all that any of us has ever wanted to hear, right? You can hear the sort of fuzzy guitar come through at the end of this take here. Yeah? Really? You want to be in this episode too, huh? Okay. I'll allow it. The structure of the main body of the song is also very Western, in that it's this sort of alternating verse, chorus, and there's a solo in the middle part. Verse, chorus, solo. It's a very rock and roll thing to do. Let's take, I Saw Her Standing There as an example. Verse, well, she was just 17. Chorus, I saw her standing there. Solo. The only thing the song really doesn't have is a middle eight. But apart from that, it's very typically sort of rock and roll. So all of that is nestled within this more classically Indian music structure, which I think is pretty cool. Then we've got our lyrics, which you could argue draw from a range of different Eastern philosophies, in that they cover, like, mortality. I quite like that line. Before I'm a dead old man. It's for the purpose of being alive. And love. Remember kids, consent is key. And not wasting time on people who are hurtful or damaging or emotional vampires. There's people standing around, go through you in the ground. They fill you in with all the things you see. And George didn't come there by way of Eastern mysticism or Buddhism or what have you. He actually arrived at this point by way of a little thing called lysergic acid diethylamide, which arguably became a pinnacle of the Western counterculture movement. Here's what the man himself has to say about it.
We took it, and ever since then it's all changed. I don't know, I just took one look at the trees and the grass and the sky, and I thought, yeah, that's it.
George Harrison says, LSD gave me the experience of I am not this body, I am pure energy soaring about everywhere that happens to be in a body for a temporary period of time. It was the awakening and the realization that the important thing in life is to ask, who am I? Where am I going? And where have I come from?
All the rest, as John said, is just a little rock and roll band. So there we have it, East meets West. But why does it work so well? My feeling is that although these two musical styles developed completely separately from each other in totally different geographical and cultural contexts, there are enough points of commonality that mean that when it's done skillfully and authentically, they blend seamlessly. Charlotte and I had a bit of a chat about this as well.
In your concert, there was a strumming pattern that you were doing that's ubiquitous in rock music. Up, down, down, up, down, down, up, down. So it sounded like dun 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 dun. Similar to that, yeah. I was trying to think where I'd heard it last night. I think it's here. Similar to that.
Okay. I know. That was the part of the places, yes.
It's so interesting because as somebody who has basically spent my entire life listening to Western music, the Indian classical music, which has a long history, sounds very modern to my ears because it's so rhythmic. Yeah. And while there is rhythm in Western classical music, the real emphasis on rhythm doesn't seem to show up in the music until basically white music interacted with black music. You started to blend the music that was coming from Africa with the music that was coming from Europe. Right. That you'd start to get like blues music, jazz music, country music, so music that had a strong rhythmic foundation.
Okay, wow. In Indian music, you can improvise as much as you improvise. That's fine. But myself and the percussionist, we have to come back and meet at the first beat. Say you're doing, say, teen tal, which is the most prevalent one with the 16-beat cycle. So you will go tha, then, tha, tha, then. So that tha is a little bit stronger than the first beat.
I think the closest equivalent is a downbeat.
Downbeat, okay.
Yeah, so if you're playing a 4-4, 1-2-3, 4, usually the downbeat is the first one. 1, 2, 3.
Also, it's the same. We call it the sum.
Right. And that's what I mean. It's so fascinating that these very disparate cultures seem to have these points of similarity.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So, yeah, Indian classical music sounds very modern, and it sounds like music that translates really well into sort of cross-pollination with Western music.
Yeah.
And here we arrive at what I think could be the most controversial part of the episode. Cultural appropriation! Yay! So cultural appropriation is when a dominant culture sort of tries on or plays around with elements of a minority culture. It's not the same thing as cultural exchange because appropriation sort of implies that there's a degree of exploitation taking place. So the elements of the minority culture might be deeply significant or part of a long historical tradition or even sacred, and in being adopted by the dominant culture it could be like misused or even desecrated, which is rude because the original culture is sort of reduced to this exotic fashion to play around with, but the appropriator never actually has to experience any of the discrimination that comes with being a part of that culture. There are many artists who have been accused of cultural appropriation. Paul Simon with Graceland.
I know what I know. I've said what I've said.
That was a debate that's sort of been floating around for a long time. Or, and to be clear, it feels very weird for me to be grouping these two together, Miley Cyrus and her sort of twerking debacle 10 or 11 years ago. I don't think that George Harrison is culturally appropriating Indian music with his inclusion of its traditions in several Beatles songs. It could have gone terribly wrong, especially given that Britain did its charming little colonial dance in India. And I'm allowed to say that because I come from a country that was colonized by the British. I'm giving myself permission. According to Oxfam, economic inequality in India today can be traced back to the colonial period, quote, affecting access to basic services, education and healthcare, and impeding realization of economic and social rights. So you can appreciate how problematic it would have been for a British pop star to take this complex classical music history from India, parody it, and then forget about it after a couple of years. I don't think that George Harrison did that at all. I think that he approached this music with respect and with a genuine, sincere interest. I really appreciate this comment by Ravi Shankar.
It is strange to see pop musicians with sitars. I was confused at first. It had so little to do with our classical music, but I found he really wanted to learn. I never thought our meeting would cause such an explosion, that Indian music would suddenly appear on the pop scene. It's peculiar, but out of this, a real interest is growing.
Lastly, I asked Shalu whether or not she liked this song, and she had this to say.
It's beautiful.
Yeah,
I quite enjoyed it.
Great,
yes, definitely.
Oh, that's very cool to hear. As somebody who comes from that tradition and has studied it to listen to this and not go, they've destroyed Indian classical music.
Not at all, not at all.
Oh, cool.
Absolutely
Very cool.
Not. Even the second one which you played, which you said it is 6 months before.
Yeah, it's called Norwegian Wood.
Even that was very nice too. Yeah, it was beautiful.
Do you know that song?
No, I'm sorry, but it's beautiful to hear to any good classical music. It's just lovely. Okay.
Thank you again for being on the show. I
My
really
pleasure.
appreciate
Thank
your time.
you for thinking about me in this. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Excellent.
It was good.
Yes, I mean you are the only sitar player that I know, but also you're a lovely person. So
thank you so much. Thank you for that too.
So, in sum, George Harrison attempted to create a perfect balance between Indian classical music and Western pop music with authenticity and respect, and the man pulled it off. It was unprecedented in rock music, in pop music. And George went from being this sort of backseat songwriter to radical innovator within the band inside of a year, say. A year before this, he was writing I Need You, which is not a bad song, but it is not this. And I think this is a really good time to remind everybody that George Harrison had just turned 23. That makes me feel like I have done naught with my life. And my favorite part of all of this, I got to have a go at playing the sitar.
May I try?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Go for it. You will need this one in your right hand index finger.
It's like a guitar pick. Have I got it on upside down?
If I can put your position right.
Absolutely. Oh, it's much harder than it looks. It's so beautiful the way you can... It's the way that it picks up the sound on the sympathetic strings.
Yes,
it's like it sings
nice.
along with your playing.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's it from me. I hope that these sort of amorphous thoughts that I've tried to wrangle into a coherent order have caused this song's detractors to give it a second thought and go, actually, this is a pretty incredible feat. Chapter 5. Here, There, and Everywhere. Today we're going to be covering what I think might be the most beautiful Beatles love song. Whew. Lofty claim, yes, but I'm going to do my best to explain why. The song is track 5, side 1 of Revolver. It is, of course, Here, There, and Everywhere. This is a song that Paul McCartney, who penned the song, George Martin, who produced the song, and John Lennon, Paul McCartney's soulmate, all cited as one of their all-time favorite Beatles songs, which is pretty incredible, given the very high caliber of their 380 to 400 song back catalogue. So basically, if you don't trust my lofty claims, you can definitely stand to trust their lofty claims. John Lennon is rarely complimentary about any songs, including his own, and yet he was consistently effusive about the track that we're going to be listening to today. Wasn't he, Storytime correspondent? Yes, indeed. We will be taking today's reading from The Good Book. In his 1980 Playboy interview, he said, "Here, There, and Everywhere was Paul's song completely, I believe, and one of my favorite songs of the Beatles." And Paul remembers, from when they were filming Help in Austria, we were playing a cassette of our new recordings and my song Here, There, and Everywhere was on. And I remember John saying, "You know, I probably like that better than any of my songs on the tape." Coming from John, that was high praise indeed. Back to you. We're going to break down why this is such a high-quality, beautiful piece of music by zeroing in on sort of three main components. The way the song was composed, the way that the lyrics are kind of gently brilliant, and the song's arrangement. Let's start with the composition of this track. Some of the Beatles songs are spectacular because they are innovative. Take, for example, A Day in the Life with its orchestral screaming climax. Is not a phrase that I thought I'd be using But here we are. Or even the song that we looked at in the last Revolver episode, Love You To, which was radical at the time that it came out because it was so culturally different from anything else on a pop record. I think putting the two side by side on this record really highlights the way that this song is beautiful because Paul McCartney is drawing from classic songwriting techniques and making it his own. So what do I mean by classic songwriting techniques? In order to dig deeper into this, I think we're going to have to travel a ways back in time. Here we go. Let's meet Paul's father, Jim. Much like Paul, Jim was a self-taught musician, and he was eventually a band leader. He led Jim Mack's jazz band, and they played what we would probably now refer to as jazz standards or the jazz songbook. Songs like this.
Chicago, Chicago, that toddling town.
Because of that, Paul McCartney had a very musical upbringing. He grew up around music. Like his family would have these huge New Year's shindigs where everyone would get together and sing, which sounds delightful. I would love a New Year's party like that. Paul talks in interviews about like songs that his dad used to sing and how he would pick them out on guitar and like play them sort of idly when he was in the Beatles and they had downtime. There was just music in his household. A lot of that music was these old standards. When I listen to a lot of Paul McCartney, I think echoes of that music really strongly come through. You hear it especially on songs like When I'm 64. Or Honey Pie.
Honey Pie.
Not to be mistaken with Wild Honey Pie. And of course, Here, There, and Everywhere. I'm going to indulge in a little bragging here and I hope that you'll allow it, but I listened to the song, I made a couple of notes, I really felt like I could hear a number of different songbook standards coming through with this song and the way that he's put it together. And I was very gratified to find out that about 10 years ago, he put out an album which included a lot of those songs that was basically a tribute to the music that he grew up with and that he had around the house when he was a child.
Even though we were working in a kind of rock and roll style, the melodic structure of some of those old songs was still there in the back of our minds, both John and I, because he too was keen on this kind of music from his youth.
So I'm just gonna pat myself on the back a little bit over that one. That's enough of that. On with the show! Here, I'm gonna outline some of those songwriting techniques. The first thing is that this song has an introduction that is separate from the rest of the song. It's this bit here. Boy, that's beautiful. That's a convention that used to show up in a lot of older songs.
A lot of old songs had a little appendage on the front. You just, I was in Manhattan, I had nothing to do. Then it goes into the song you go, oh, I know that one. I get a kick out of you. But there's this mysterious period before you go, what the is this, you know?
An example from that album of his from 10 years ago might be the jazz standard Bye Bye Blackbird, which begins like this.
Blackbird, blackbird, singing the blues all day.
But the actual song sounds like this.
Back up all my cares and woe.
Another thing is that this song has a little bit of the jazz influence that a lot of traditional pop music would have had when Paul was a young kid. Because these big pop stars like the Rat Pack were incorporating all of these like jazz elements into their popular songs. For example, this song has a sort of A-B structure where there's a main section and then there's a secondary section. This is the main section. And the B section would be this.
I want her everywhere, and if she's beside me, I know I need never care.
That's not how traditional rock and roll is structured, where you might have a verse, a chorus, a solo section, a middle eight. You're gonna end on the chorus. We all know that structure. I saw her standing there.
Well, we danced through a night, and we held each other's side.
Or All My Loving.
All my loving, I will sing to you.
Can't Buy Me Love. They have some variation on that structure. This song doesn't have a clear chorus. It doesn't really have a middle eight. It's just this A section and this B section, and they're alternating throughout the piece. It's also got these very tidy little things at the end of each of the sections, which are called turnarounds. And they're designed to sort of take us as the listener from one section of the song into the next without it feeling jarring. If it's done well, it's immensely satisfying. For example, going from the A section into the B section, Paul does this. Do you see how the song sort of changes its mood? But it doesn't sort of shove us into it, it sort of picks us up and lifts us into it. Show us what that means, piano correspondent, please and thank you. Hello. So as we come out of the A part, each one believing that love never dies, watching her eyes and hoping I'm always. Paul uses these chords to get into the B part. Boom! Totally different feel. He could just go from here, I want her everywhere, but he gives us this little, this chord here, just tidies things up a little bit, and has that, I believe it's called a 5-1 change, because without getting too technical, we've now moved into B flat, and the fifth note of the B flat major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, F. In Western music, the fifth chord to the first chord is like one of the most ubiquitous transitions. So it's used all throughout jazz, all throughout popular music of the 20th century. The end. And that's what Paul's doing here. Ta-da! Turns out it's jazz! He does it again at the other end, like this. Oh, isn't that lovely? That actually takes me to my next point as well. The majority of the song is in a major feel. But then in the B section it switches to a minor feel. And this is straight out of the songbook playbook. Songbook playbook.
I would hear something happen musically that I didn't know what it was, but I would think, that's nice. For instance, the changes from a minor key to a major key within a song.
You can hear it on songs like Cheek to Cheek, where the A part sounds like this.
Heaven, I'm in heaven. And then it goes into the middle. Dance with me, arms around you, the charms around you will carry me through to heaven.
And the B part sounds like that.
And you're back at the beginning, and it was like, wow, how'd they do that? And I remember as a kid thinking, I love that.
And what I love about it in this song is that it creates this tension and then this perfect release when we come back to the A section. Especially when you've got that swelling of vocal coming up underneath. Ah, beautiful. It's almost angelic. Like a breath of fresh air, that is. We're sort of moving the melody around this kind of G minor feel. And if she's beside me, I know I need minor feel. But to love her is to need her major feel. Going from that minor feel to major feel, that's what gives you that feeling of, release, deep breath, everything's gonna be okay. If only Paul McCartney. And that's another 5-1 actually. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are sort of fundamental techniques that are used in song composition from way, way, way back. And Paul McCartney is incorporating them in this very modern, sleek song. The end.
It comes back to where it started. A very simple trick, but kind of quite effective.
Interestingly, the Beatles also did this on the song From Me to You.
It kind of goes, if there's anything that you want, if there's anything I can do, tell me, you. So that's kind of straightforward. Then it goes, I got arms that long to hold you. It's just that. Hey?
Another sort of older quality that this song has is strong melody writing. I think that a song has a strong melody if you can sing it on its own without any backing, and it is still enjoyable and clear where the song is going. Let's get the piano correspondent to dig a little deeper on this one. This is a song that has an incredibly strong melody. It's dynamic, it's moving all over the place. It's not static, as opposed to like...
This one makes use of so many notes. It's never really static. And it's a melody that if you took the backing away would still be very pretty. Part of the reason for that is that the melody actually outlines the chords that it's sitting on top of. So the first chord is this, and Paul is singing that root note here. When the melody comes back in, the chord that is sitting underneath it is B minor. Those are the notes in B minor. And he's singing, so he's basically singing that chord. The next chord is C major. And his melody goes, or let's take the B part for example. The I want her everywhere goes over a B flat chord. And he sings, he's singing the chord, just out of order. That is a hallmark of classic songwriting. These classic songs, if the melodies are written well, will tell you what key you're in, whether it's major or minor, even what the chords are. And that's what Paul McCartney's doing in this song with his melody. Exquisite. The last thing that jumps out here is the use of what's called chromaticism, which is when instead of playing a major or minor scale, you're playing every single note. Like this. This is a major scale. This is a minor scale. And this is a chromatic scale which plays all of the in-between notes. I notice it in the B section where the guitar is doing this. So instead of playing da 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 da, it's playing all of the in-between notes. Chromaticism is a very jazz thing to do. So this is a very fast and very exaggerated example, but here's a little clip of a Charlie Parker solo that is just crammed with chromaticism. So there we go. In that sense, it's sort of a very old-fashioned song, or at least it's a song that has an old soul. This song feels like a sister song to In My Life. In my life. Because John Lennon's In My Life. Contentious, I know. You can watch that episode if you want that minor drama broken down. I think that also draws from the classic songwriting traditions. That is a beautiful song, again, not because it's like nothing you've ever heard before, but because just the way that the chords are put together is very pleasing. The way that the melody joins those chords, very tidy, very skilled songwriting there. It also has a very contemporary sound because of the arrangement, which we will come back to. First though, I would like to talk about these lyrics. So let's do that. The lyrics of this song are simple, but I think they're some of my favorites of Paul McCartney's because he can be quite a private person, I think, when it comes to his lyrics. He might write perfectly lovely lyrics for songs, but it doesn't always feel like they're coming from the heart. And it can feel like he's got a bit of a guard up, like he's cautious to not let you in too much. This song is completely the opposite of that. It's vulnerable, it's open, it's stark, and that feels really authentic. When you look at a lot of the Beatles' earlier love songs, while they may be referring to a specific person, a specific subject, often they don't give you any details about those people. Like a song like Ticket to Ride is almost reporting like,
you said that living with me was bringing her down.
She'll never be free while I'm around. These are all like things that she has said. If we go back further, we've got a song like I Saw Her Standing There, which is purely physical description. She was just 17, you know what I mean. One, you can't really picture that. And two, the singer doesn't really know anything about this person. This song very intimately refers to a specific person. Like in this line, this woman is... And Paul is... On this song, Paul clearly knows this woman. He's familiar with these very specific mannerisms, like the wave of her hand. He has looked in her eyes, he is watching her eyes and hoping that he's always there. I think that's beautiful. There is a gorgeous intimacy about that. It's almost the sort of domestic mundanity of it. This is a song about the little things, about the specific details. And then there's this sort of depth of his desire, and lines like this. I want her everywhere. I want her everywhere. Want, desire. That's a different kind of desire from the way she looked was way beyond compare. Oof, what a hottie.
is very different from to love her is to need her everywhere. Watching her eyes and hoping I'm always there. That feels a lot more profound. That is a different kind of want, desire, need. And in a way, it takes a lot of guts to be that honest, that candid, sharing those moments of your relationship with other people. So I suppose what this all boils down to is something I said a little bit earlier. Authenticity. This is a relatable experience to anybody who's ever had that kind of intimacy with their romantic partner. It's simple, but it's honest, it's intimate, it's authentic. And I think Paul has done that so well on this track. Which brings us to our last point, arrangement. It feels almost like a contradiction to be talking about the arrangement, because if we look at the last of Paul's songs that we explored on this series, Eleanor, Rigby, that's a song that has been immaculately arranged. Like, there's a string part that was written specifically for that song. With this song, by contrast, they have taken everything that makes up the Beatles and stripped it back to its barest components. There's hardly any drum. There's very little percussion. The guitar is fairly sparse. The bass is very quiet in the mix, although Paul does play some tasty little bass flourishes, some of which the bass correspondent will show you now. You know, there's the one that goes... And then there's this one as well. It's very simple, but it adds a delightful little point of interest. Which means that what we're left with is Paul McCartney's beautiful melody and a tight, intimate backing vocal. It took approximately 3 days to record this song, and most of those 3 days were dedicated to crafting that backing vocal and perfecting it. In that sense, the song is sort of like a distillation of why the Beatles are so impressive vocally. And again, I do think that it harkens back to that sort of older songwriting tradition. It almost smacks of like barbershop, or something like the Ink Spots.
I'd find you.
I believe Paul McCartney said that the backing vocals were inspired by the Beach Boys.
But she looks in my eyes and makes me realize that she...
But of course, Brian Wilson was inspired by those same sort of barbershop-y traditions, like the Four Freshmen.
It's a blue world alone.
So it's all kind of coming back to that. And I suppose it makes sense because we all soak up whatever it is that we're listening to when we're young. It forms our musical foundations. And if you're a songwriter, it makes sense that that's going to bleed through into your work. In fact, that's one of my favorite things about songwriting. It's like your own personal musical footprint. You never know exactly what's going to come out when you're writing music. Sometimes it's something entirely unexpected, something you haven't listened to in years. Sometimes your brain just farts them out. Maybe that was a poor choice of words. It sort of makes crass something that I think is almost sacrosanct. But I think it made the point well enough. The last thing I really love about the arrangement of this piece is that although it's very simple and very short, there is a slight build so that the second half isn't just an exact repetition of the beginning. For example, the bass part that we mentioned earlier does get busier. Those tasty flourishes that the bass correspondent showed us earlier come later and later in the song, and they become increasingly complicated as the song progresses. Or they introduce a harmony on the last Love Never Dies. Beautiful descending harmony there.
Love never dies, watching her eyes.
Very simple detail. Very pretty. Before I talked about how the song has an old-fashioned feel to it, but I think it's the instrumentation that modernizes it. Specifically, I think it's that they still have that contemporary rock and roll layout. As a group, you've got your guitars, your bass, your drums, but it's blended with these old-fashioned sort of barbershop-y harmonies and a beautiful, gentle, sweet melody sung over very tidy, very satisfying chords. And there we have it. It's so simple, this song. So bare, almost. But Paul McCartney clearly is a bit of a sponge and can take in all of these different influences that he's listening to. Quite simply, I think Paul McCartney just does everything right on this one. And it's not the kind of everything right that you can follow to the letter. That's the magic of it. It doesn't sound like any other song
particularly. It stands up in its own right, but it's also comfortably familiar when you listen to it. Just songwriting perfection. Chapter 6. Yellow Submarine. And yes, I do see the irony of bordering this in green marker instead of yellow. But here we are. Today's song is much maligned, widely viewed as the worst song on Revolver. I think that that's not exactly fair, and this is going to be my best attempt at bringing about some justice for Yellow Submarine.
In the town where I was born lived a man who sailed to sea.
You gotta love that slightly tuneless, very out of tune entrance to the song. Let's have it one more time.
In the town.
In the town. He starts on completely the wrong note. Bless his little heart. Yellow Submarine is a children's song. Yes, it is a children's song that does its job really well, but it's more than that. It's also a record of one of the greatest parties of the 1960s. Today we're going to track this song from its inception, through its very festive, playful recording sessions, and outwards to its release and broader cultural legacy. By way of introduction though, I'd just like to point out, embarrassingly, this is me in high school, and this is the lunchbox that I brought with me every day for 4 years of secondary schooling. I was actually known at my school as the girl with the Yellow Submarine lunchbox. So I suppose in that sense, this song is part of my history. Right. Here's Yellow Submarine's origin story. For years, Paul was telling everyone that this was his song and John helped out a lot. John was even telling people that this was Paul's song and he helped out a little bit. However, when they released the super deluxe version of the remixed Revolver, one of the things that was included was this lovely, sweet little demo. Turns out they were all wrong. John wrote the verses to this song. Here's what that first iteration sounds like.
In the place where I was born, no one cared, no one cared.
Lovely little lilting 3/4, very folksy tune. It's almost Dylan-esque in places, I think. Meanwhile, Mr. Paul McCartney was elsewhere conceiving of what John later called a catchy little chorus. Let's go now to our Storytime correspondent. We will be taking today's first reading from, predictably, The Good Book. This is Paul speaking. I remember lying in bed one night, in that moment before you're falling asleep, that little twilight moment when a silly idea comes into your head, and thinking of Yellow Submarine. We all live in a yellow submarine. Which means that this song is in the tradition of like the Lennon-McCartney mergers, like A Day in the Life, or We Can Work It Out, where one of them brought half the song and the other brought the other half of the song and they just smushed them together. This is the second outtake, in which they've sort of changed it from that 3/4 sound to a 4/4 sound.
In the town where I was born,
Paul's bringing in his chorus.
we all live in a yellow submarine. Look out, yellow submarine. Get down, yellow submarine.
It's gone from being quite plaintive to storytelling, partly with the help of Donovan,
They call me Mellow Yellow.
who contributed the line, "Sky of blue and sea of green."
Sky of blue and sea of green.
Valuable contribution, I like that line a lot. I think the melody is often discounted in this song because the chorus is such an earworm and can be quite annoying, but the melody in the verse is actually quite lovely. In fact, I wanted to share with you that musicologist Alan Pollock says of John's melody, in a subtle way, it bears the Lennon stamp of pentatonicism. But I'm sure we were all thinking it, so that probably goes without saying. So they've each gone away, they've conceived of their parts, they've brought them together, they've workshopped it, the time has come for the first recording session, and George Martin is out with food poisoning. So in a sense they took a very cats away, mice will play approach to this session, and there was a very silly, playful atmosphere that I think probably set the tone for the rest of the recording sessions for the song, which we will come to. But first we will go back to the Storytime correspondent, who will lead us in a reading from sound engineer Jeff Emmerich's book, Here, There and Everywhere. George's absence clearly had a liberating effect on the four Beatles. They behaved like a bunch of schoolboys with a substitute teacher filling in.
As a result, there was a lot of clowning around that evening, silliness that George Martin would not have tolerated, and so rehearsals took up a lot more time than the session itself. It was Lennon who finally got over his attack of the giggles and took on the role of responsible adult, admonishing the others, "Come on, it's getting late and we still haven't made us a record." This, of course, only had the effect of sending everyone into another fit of laughter. Such fun. We'll be seeing a lot of her this episode. The last sort of nerdy tidbit about this first recording session. Listen to this last verse. So you might have noticed, if you're as big a geek as I am, that John's response doesn't come in until A Life of Ease. He's missed the first line. And the reason for that is that one of the more sort of junior engineers accidentally erased it, and all of the other engineers sort of closed ranks around him and lied to John Lennon and said it was because they had to make room on some of the tape. That's why that line's missing. So we arrive at the second recording session. This is the really fun one. I'm going to do my best to paint a picture of this scene. Paul McCartney initially conceived of this song as a sing-along. So in order to create that atmosphere, they invited a bunch of people to the studio, including Mick Jagger and Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger's girlfriend, Marianne Faithfull, George's wife, Pattie Boyd. I'd like to take this moment to point out that George's wife was in the recording studio long before John's wife was, but that's neither here, there, or everywhere. Mal Evans, the Beatles' sort of roadie slash mum, and Neil Aspinall, who was also a friend of theirs from when they were young and part of the Beatles' general entourage. I don't remember exactly what he did, but I think it was something to do with press. They were all dressed in their finest Carnaby Street outfits, the women in mini skirts and flowing blouses, the men in purple bell-bottoms and fur jackets. And they were all totally sober. This motley crew raids the EMI store cupboard of anything that might make an interesting noise. Whistles, chains, bells, glasses, cash tills, hooters. And they set about making all of these fun sound effects for this track. Like you can hear the ocean on the track at the beginning of verse 2.
Though we sailed onto the sun.
That's George Harrison swirling water around in a tub. Brian Jones is clinking glasses.
And our friends are all alone.
It sounds like a party's happening. Pattie Boyd makes this fantastic shrieking noise in the middle of all of that. And hear her go, woo! Right about here. John's blowing bubbles in a cup at one point to make that sort of bubbling noise here. Right through that bit. John is completely revved up about this, and he announces, I want to sing underwater. And Jeff Emmerich's like, there's no way that that's going to be able to happen. So first John tries gargling, and he nearly chokes. Then he calls for an entire tank to be brought into the studio so that he can actually submerge himself and sing underwater. He could have just stuck his face in the bathtub. He didn't need an entire tank, but this is John Lennon, and we know that he doesn't really do things by halves. Finally, Jeff Emmerich suggests that they could submerge the microphone in the water. Jeff's trying to work out what they're going to wrap it in so that it can go in the water and obviously not get wet. Meanwhile, John's asking Mal Evans what he might be able to contribute to sort out this problem. Mal always tried to be prepared for every contingency, because if the Beatles wanted something and he didn't have it, they would give him a hard time.
Mal, we should get a hammer and an anvil. See you later. Clang, clang, Maxwell silver hammer.
As a result, he carried around a doctor's bag inside which he'd stashed all sorts of things. Picks, guitar strings, fuses, flashlights, crisps, biscuits, even household items like tissues which he'd whip out if one of them had a cold. John must have figured that if anyone was going to have a solution to our dilemma, it was Mal. He didn't disappoint. With a wink and a sly grin, the burly roadie reached into the bag, fished around for a moment, and cheerfully waved a condom aloft. Well done, Malcolm, John proclaimed as the others burst into laughter. After all, we don't want the microphone to be getting in the family way, do we? As it happened, that didn't work anyway, and they ended up having to plug the microphone into the guitar amp to get that. Jeff Emmerich found out years later that that particular microphone that they used was phantom powered, which means that it was a live electrical object. Any of them could easily have been electrocuted that night. Fortunately, nobody was electrocuted that night. Also, this bit here
That's Ringo standing in the hallway outside the recording studio, shouting, and the mic's picking that up. At one point, all of them crowded into the echo room, which is basically a concrete room that you fire the noise into and it bounces off the concrete walls and you record that and it creates like reverb. And it just gives the recording a little bit of atmosphere. That's how they used to do reverb and echo before digital reverb and echo. Cool. The whole group went missing and Jeff Emmerich went looking for them and they were continuing their sobriety in the echo chamber and like lighting incense to cover the smell of their sobriety. Even the studio staff joined in. At the choruses, especially the last ones, we all live in a yellow submarine. That's everybody singing. That's Mal and Neil and the studio techs and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and various girlfriends. It's everyone singing together. Paul got his sing-along. Near the end of the session, around midnight, Mal Evans, who's a big guy, straps a bass drum to his chest. Everybody's following Mal with his bass drum. Boom. And they're all marching and they're all belting the chorus in a conga line around the recording studio. What an absolute blast. I wish I'd have been able to see that. Unfortunately, I made the mistake of trying to get AI to render that and I ended up with these ghastly, grotesque images. I'm sorry you had to see that, but also I'm glad that I'm not the only person who had to see that. Oh, and the brass band bit, here. They had to get the song done quickly, so they didn't have time to write a part and get a brass band in and record it that way, especially as they only needed it for like 2 bars. But in order to avoid copyright issues, they clipped it into bits, tossed it in the air, spliced it together, included that in the recording. Which is why, yeah, it sounds familiar, but it's not quite right. George Martin described this session as being more like something that he did with the Goons, because of course he used to produce comedy records before he did the Beatles. Basically, it was a blast. Everyone had a ball, everyone was in great spirits. I love to hear that, especially when you consider how much more somber the end of the Beatles' career became. It's so lovely to just imagine this scene in which everyone is just a little bit jolly, having a marvelous time together. The studio techs, the roadies, the friends, the band themselves. It's just such a joyful occasion. I think that really comes through in the recording. It reminds me of that scene in A Hard Day's Night where they're all gallivanting around in a field. It has that energy to it. As the listener, it feels like you are part of that party. It's like you're being let in and getting to see that sort of boundless, energetic joy. That Beatle joy that, as a fan, is one of my favorite things about them as a group. You see it in their movies, in their interviews, and their live performances. They were really good friends and they were silly together. That silliness is one of the most enjoyable aspects of the Beatles from a fan's perspective. I mean, listen to John Lennon just letting loose here. Just absolutely going ham.
In our yellow submarine.
The silly accents, the laughing, the wild abandon. You can just see him hamming it up in the studio, you know? Oh, it's a good feeling. See, I think a lot of people get caught up in the annoying, ubiquitous chorus, but you've got to remember that this is the background behind it. This is the joyful, fun occasion that spawned this song that is now really not looked favorably upon. Not looked upon favorably. I think that's the correct way to say that. I think a lot of younger listeners to the Beatles, myself included, probably didn't appreciate how successful this song was on its release. It was released as a double A-side single with Eleanor Rigby. Odd choice. And it went to #1 in the UK, a number of European countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. Good taste, New Zealand, well done. And it peaked at #2 on the US Billboard Hot 100 chart, possibly because at the time that it was released, they were sort of embroiled in that Bigger Than Jesus scandal, but only so much that it bumped them 1 spot from their usual #1 position. I'm sure they weren't too cut up about it. I mean, this song won the Ivor Novello Award for highest certified sales of an A-side in 1966. This was a huge song, and the wildest thing about that is that it is a children's song. Let's back up a little bit. I want to talk about this song in the context of the whole album, right? I am of the opinion that Revolver is the real Magical Mystery Tour. The songs are just compositional magic. stunning, incredibly skilled pieces of music. Individually, there's the mystery of what's going to be thrown at you next, because every song is so different from the previous one and the one following. And as a whole, the album is a whirlwind tour across genres. It is the original Magical Mystery Tour. For me anyway, as a listener. I think that Yellow Submarine plays an important part in all of that. Every song on this album brings something unique and important to the whole. What this song brings is a levity and a silliness that we haven't yet seen. And I'm sure I'll come back to this in the final episode, but we've seen political satire, earnest, bleak, classically influenced storytelling. John Lennon takes a nap. We've had Indian music, a perfectly composed, beautiful love song. What else could we have but a children's song, right? People look to songs like Love You Too and Tomorrow Never Knows as revolutionary and radical, and they are that. But this song, I think, is often overlooked as part of the revolutionary nature of this album. What rock band has released a children's song in the middle of a rock album? More than that, the Beatles, at the time, the biggest rock and roll megastars that the world had ever seen, bigger even than Elvis, arguably bigger than Jesus. Did I say that? No, John Lennon did. These mad lads put out a single that had this children's song on one side and a song on the other that featured no conventional rock instruments. In fact, it featured only one of the four musicians. And it was a double A-side. That's unprecedented. The only other example I can think of a legitimate musical outfit performing in earnest a children's song is Peter, Paul and Mary doing Puff the Magic Dragon.
Sing it now, Puff the Magic Dragon.
Which you could argue that they were doing a lot of in the recording sessions for this track. Let me know if you can think of any other examples, but that's all I was able to conjure up just off the top of my head. And as a children's song, it does its job really well. As I may have covered at some point in all of this, the Beatles were very good at their job. We've got all of the very on-the-nose sound effects to illustrate what's happening in the lyrics. Like, when they sing, "Our friends are all aboard," that's when everyone comes in. The party doesn't start at the first verse. The first verse, we have just the instrumentation. And Ringo. Everyone always forgets Ringo.
In the town where I was born.
Second verse, he sings "So We've Sailed," and that's when we hear the ocean.
So we sail up to the sun.
Third verse, "And our friends are all aboard," that's when all of the people join the party.
And our friends are all aboard.
Chatter, chatter, chatter. And the band begins to play. Everything is illustrated. It's very children's song. It's very in the children's tradition. I mean, Paul said himself, I quite like children's things. I like children's minds and imagination. So it didn't seem uncool to me to have a pretty surreal idea that was also a children's idea. I thought also with Ringo being so good with children, it might not be a bad idea for him to have a children's song rather than a very serious song. He wasn't that keen on singing. It's very effective, it's very singable, it's not particularly complicated. And they picked the best vocalist for the job on this one. Who else could sing this but Ringo, the man who would become the narrator for The Point?
Once upon a time, a long way from here and a long way from now, there was a tiny village where everything all had points on them.
Highly underrated children's film featuring a lovely soundtrack by one Harry Nilsson. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. Thomas the Tank Engine.
Thomas is a tank engine who lives at a big station on the island of Sodor.
When John sang it in that early demo, he sounded a little bit too plaintive, I think.
No one cares, no one cares.
Works, but not for what the song became. Paul, I think, would have been a little bit too self-conscious to be able to really carry it off.
Get down, Yellow Submarine.
Ringo is the perfect choice. Because, as Jeff Emmerich not so diplomatically says, almost every Beatles album had one song with a lead vocal by Ringo, despite the fact that he could barely sing. But the fans ate it up. And I have to admit there was something endearing about his voice, even if it was just the fact that you could hear him constantly straining to stay on pitch. Yeah, that does make his the perfect voice for this recording, I think. There are many people who have attributed the name of the song to drug references. For instance, they say that the voyage that the song is about is a metaphor for an LSD trip. When John and George had their very first LSD trip, they got back to George's house and John Lennon saw it as a submarine with himself as the captain. Or even that there was a barbiturate called Nembutol that came in yellow capsules. But I think that this is all total bull. This is a children's song. Despite that, it took on this much broader cultural significance. There's a music journalist named Pete Doggett who called the song culturally empty and made the point that that made it the perfect kind of Rorschach test for anyone with political leanings. For instance, the chorus was appropriated by UC Berkeley students at an anti-war protest in 1966, in which they sort of taunted the authorities and the university higher-ups by singing a song that never ends style rendition of just looping choruses of this song, which I think would be enough to drive anyone nuts. In that, it sort of became a bit of an anthem for protests. In more recent protests, that chorus has been appropriated but switched with the lyrics, "We all live in a fascist regime." Colorful. Fun. Later in 1966, there was another anti-war protest in San Francisco this time, and there was a giant papier-mâché yellow submarine that was carried over the crowd. Also cool. Also fun. Maybe I should make a papier-mâché yellow submarine, you know, with my abundance of free time. And Time magazine labeled that, and I quote, "a symbol of the psychedelic set's desire for escape." Beat poet Leroy Jones called the song a reflection of white American society's exclusivity and separation from reality. He says, I quote, "The Beatles can sing 'We All Live in a Yellow Submarine' because that is literally where they and all their people would like to live, in the solipsistic pink and white nightmare of the special life." I think he may be reading a little bit too into it, given that he's coming from an American background, as he states, white American society, and the song is actually sung by British men who are sort of somewhat removed from that cultural backdrop. But I like the turn of phrase nonetheless, so we'll give him points for that. Donovan, who we mentioned earlier in the episode, said that this song represented the Beatles' imprisonment as internationally famous mega superstars. I disagree with all of them. This is a children's song! Surely most people can recognize that this is just a children's song, right? No deeper meaning. If you think that there's a deeper meaning, tell me about it in the comments. I would love to hear your theories about what this song is really about. Genuinely, I would love that. I always read the comments. Chapter 7. She Said, She Said. I am especially excited about this week's episode. I know that I say I'm excited every week. It's possible that it's because I'm just an excitable person, but there are two things of significance that are making this episode especially exciting for me. The first is that we're going to be listening to my favorite song on side A of Revolver today. The second is that I'm really close to 2,000 subscribers, and this week may be the week that that happens. It might not be, but it might be. So I'm excited nonetheless. Restless with anticipation. But back to the music. My favorite song on side A of Revolver sounds like this. God, that's a cool opener to a song. I love this one. Okay, there are many reasons musically why this is my favorite song on side A, and we're gonna dig into that. But in order to really get under the hood of this song, I think that a closer examination of the Beatles' relationship with lysergic acid diethylamide is in order. I'm sure that's not what you thought I was going to say. For the uninitiated, that is the chemical name for LSD, or as it is colloquially known, acid. About a year before they recorded this song, in March of 1965, John Lennon and George Harrison and their respective partners went to dinner with a dentist.
And he put it in our coffee and never told us. And we never heard of it.
Predictably, shenanigans ensued as they went about their evening on the town, absolutely off their nuts on LSD.
You know, we were just insane. We got in the lift and we all thought there was a fire in the lift. It was just a little red light and we were all screaming like that. And the lift stops and the door opens and we were all going, ah!
This isn't strictly related to the song, but I think the first thing that I would like to note is that it's very not cool to give people psychoactive substances without their consent. I hope that goes without saying. Despite this lack of consent, it was a life-changing experience for both John and George.
We went out to a club and it was incredible. It was really incredible.
The Storytime correspondent will tell you a little bit more about that first night. Good day to you. All of today's readings will be taken from The Good Book. John says of the experience, it was terrifying, but it was fantastic. And George elaborates.
That first time I had acid, a light bulb went on in my head and an illumination goes on inside. In 10 minutes, I lived 10,000 years. Approximately 5 months later, John and George dropped acid for a second time. There was a bit of a gap in their touring schedule. They were at a house in Beverly Hills and it was quickly swarmed by fans. So rather than try and get past the hordes of fans, they decided to invite some people over, have some guests, have a little party. 3 things happened that I think made this a really significant day. The first thing is that George and John were desperate for the other two to try acid because they felt like they'd had this, again, life-altering experience that the other two had not, and so they weren't really relating to them as well as they would like to. George describes this explicitly in Anthology. There was one very important day at that house. John and I had decided that Paul and Ringo had to have acid because we couldn't relate to them anymore. Not just on the one level, we couldn't relate to them on any level because acid had changed us so much. It was all too important to John and me. And eventually, Ringo did decide to partake. Paul did not.
We'd heard that you're never the same. It alters your life and you never think the same again. And I think John was rather excited by that prospect. I was rather frightened by that prospect. Just what I need.
We'll come back to this. The second thing is that Roger McGuinn and David Crosby, my king, of the Byrds were at this party, also on acid, and George got to talking to David about his new interest in Indian music, and David recommended to George that he listen to this artist called Ravi Shankar. The third thing is that the actor Peter Fonda, in his pre-Easy Rider days, was also at this party. Now, from the way that Peter Fonda tells it, he was having a marvelous time. He says, "They were so enthusiastic, so full of fun. John was the wittiest and most astute. I enjoyed just hearing him speak." From his perspective, what happened is that George was beginning to experience, I believe, what's called ego death. He felt like he was dying. And in order to comfort George, Peter Fonda was telling him a story about how he had almost died when he was younger. He kept saying, "I know what it's like to be dead." From the Beatles' perspective, though, this was received completely differently. John says, "And this guy, who I didn't really know, kept coming over wearing shades saying, 'I know what it's like to be dead.' And we kept leaving him because he was so boring. It was scary when you're flying high. Don't tell me about it. I don't want to know what it's like to be dead." That's how I wrote She Said, I Know What It's Like to Be Dead. It was an acidy song. George says, "I don't know how, but Peter Fonda was there. He kept saying, 'I know what it's like to be dead.' He'd accidentally shot himself at some time and he was showing us his bullet wound. He was very uncool." And so John Lennon kicked Peter Fonda out. Right, now why are those 3 things significant? The Peter Fonda thing is significant because clearly it provided the literal lyrical inspiration for the song.
She said, I know what it's like to be dead. And she's making me feel like I'll never belong.
What a great song. The thing with David Crosby is significant because it's possible that without having had that conversation, we wouldn't then have had sitar on Norwegian Wood. We may not have had Love You To. George may not have ended up having lessons with Ravi Shankar. And as we sort of looked at in the Love You To episode, George's interest in Indian music trickled through to the rest of what the Beatles were doing and became a big part of the Beatles' sound from that point through to the rest of their career together. And then there's Paul choosing not to take the acid. The fact that George and John had had this life-altering experience and they wanted Paul to join in and Paul chose not to at this point in time changed the interpersonal dynamics of the band. That's not to say Paul should have just gone along with it, because I don't think that that's the sort of thing that you should just hurry into or be peer pressured into, and clearly he wasn't in the right mindset for it. Anyway, it could have been a disaster.
So I delayed, and I was seen to sort of stall a little bit, I think, within the group.
However, John and George were not necessarily the nicest about it, and teased Paul about how they were in on it and he was not.
A lot of peer pressure. I mean, talk about peer pressure. The Beatles?
That was probably very difficult for Paul because up until this point, the supremacy of John Lennon and Paul McCartney as primary songwriters was unbreakable. This shifted that. And it was a shift in those relationships that persisted. Because you have to remember that when George joined the band, he was just this skinny little kid. And John was 17 years old. He was nearly an adult. So for the longest time,
George was like a little brother. He was this little kid. There was an age gap, there was a maturity gap. To hear George tell it, they did acid together and they became these sort of bonded equals where the age gap stopped mattering. That I was younger or I was smaller was no longer any kind of embarrassment with John. John and I spent a lot of time together from then on, and I felt closer to him than all the others right through until his death. An interesting nugget of information is that Paul did end up doing acid about 4 months after this party. Interestingly though, none of the other 3 Beatles was present. One of the guys who was present that evening, this guy, went on to crash his car and die a few years later. John Lennon read the news article about it, wrote a song about it, and it went like this.
He blew his mind out in a car.
So perhaps because of that last point, this song, She Said, is very much the John and George show. I think a strength of this song is that it showcases some of the strongest qualities in each of the 2 songwriters coming together. Let's dig into that. George helped John write this song. John was in a little bit of a writing funk. He had really only contributed a few songs to this album, and as he said, he was spending mostly a lot of his time sleeping. George went over one day and John had all of these little song fragments. George helped him to stitch all of those little fragments together. For instance, this is a demo of one of those little fragments.
She said, I will love you more than this. I said, no, 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 it's wrong. Now it's wrong.
Second, I think that the bedrock of this song is this sort of like droning heaviness. So the chord is changing, the bass is static. The bass has this boom, boom, ba-doom, boom, 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 ba-doom, boom, boom. And it doesn't change even though the chord over the top is changing. That gives it a heaviness and a drone. I think the drone has a bit of an Indian influence because in a lot of Indian music, again, there's more about this in the Love You To episode, there's an instrument called a tanpura which lays a drone. It just plays the same notes over and over and over again in a consistent but very simple rhythm. That allows lead instruments like the sitar to really expand melodically and percussion instruments like the tabla to do interesting things rhythmically. In this case, it really feels like the bass is establishing that similar drone feel because it's not changing note even though everything on the top of it is. It sounds like this. Same note, bum bum ba-dum bum bum, or whatever the rhythm is. That's enough bass singing for me today. So this sort of Indian-tinged drone foundation is operating in tandem with John Lennon's newfound propensity for psychedelic, emulating, expansive heaviness in his compositions. Almost sluggish. You can hear it in Rain. In I'm Only Sleeping. In Tomorrow Never Knows.
Turn off your mind, relax and float downstream.
And together I really feel like with those 2 things, they've given us the blueprint for acid rock or for psychedelic rock. And you can really hear traces of that sound in later psychedelic or acid rock bands like Cream.
In a white room with black curtains near the station.
Deep Purple. Jefferson Airplane.
Look what's happening on the street, got a revolution.
Obviously the Grateful Dead.
Fortune comes a-crawling, Calliope woman.
And of course MC5. I put that in there for you, Abby. Interestingly, you can also hear echoes of it in this sort of psychedelic renaissance of the 90s. It sort of transferred into pop music in the 90s. Like, have a listen to the beginning of this song. And now listen to the beginning of Madonna's Beautiful Stranger. And psychedelic rock is a genre that's still very much with us in artists like Tame Impala, another Australian band, King Gizzard, MGMT.
I'm feeling rough, I'm feeling wrong in the time
one of my favorites, Unknown Mortal Orchestra. So once again with this brilliant album, the Beatles are helping to invent genres left, right and centre. Amazing. Then there's their vocal blend.
I know what it's like to be dead.
They blend so well together. I think both voices have that sort of slightly nasal, almost sardonic edge. And when you put them together, they just sound perfect. You can barely separate the two voices. I think John is singing the bottom part and George is singing the higher harmony. It's a really interesting harmony too, because you would think it would sound like this.
I know what it's like to be dead.
But that's not what he sings. It's a slightly higher note at the end of the phrases, like this.
I know what it's like to be dead. I know what it is to be sad.
Oh, so good. There's some great harmonies on this track. Listen to this bit here.
She said, you don't understand what I said. I said, no, 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 you're wrong.
And then again here, lower.
Everything was right. Everything was right.
They sound so good together. And this is a really interesting example again, because usually if there are two voices singing, it's John and Paul.
'Cause I couldn't stand the pain.
Not John and George. There are plenty of songs where we get the three of them together, and that is also a brilliant vocal blend.
This boy wants you back again.
But this just works on a whole other level. The odd changes in meter in the middle of the song also feel like both a John thing and a George thing. Again, because Indian music features a lot of time signatures that to our Western ears we might feel as unconventional, like 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3. Those sorts of things where it feels like the downbeat's in the wrong place. But John also does weird things with changing feels in songs, like Happiness is a Warm Gun does it multiple times. You start in this very straightforward 4/4.
She's not a girl who misses much.
And then you change to something that's a bit more like a waltz. And then you change to something that was so difficult that it took something like 100 takes, 90-something takes to get this right.
For the superior jump the gun.
Those sorts of like weird idiosyncrasies. And it happens in this song, where we go from 4/4 to 3/4, like this. 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 1 2 3. And then after the last, everything was right 2 3. I said 3 4. And it's a little bit jarring, but that makes the song exciting. It keeps you on your toes. And it really does feel like a beautiful marriage of John's songwriting sensibilities and George's songwriting sensibilities. What else? It ends on this fantastic call-in response between the two vocalists. And this is where you can really hear how similar their vocal tones are. I believe it starts with John, and then George is the response. John! George!
She said, I know what it's like to be dead. I know what it's like to be.
You can hear that they're two distinct voices, but when they blend together, they are just similar enough that they sound like a whole other animal. It's magical. You can almost hear the bond between these two musicians jumping out of the recording. Like, it's no wonder that Paul walked out of the studio when they were recording this. You know, he says it was because of creative differences. Maybe it was, but also maybe it was watching your best friend make a new best friend. And that's not to say that it ruined Paul's relationship with John by any stretch of the imagination, but if John was the only person you've ever written music with, and now he's writing music with somebody else, I can see how Paul might feel a little bit jealous. That's my take anyway. And I reckon my bromance theory isn't ridiculous, because when John Lennon played his last ever live performance with Elton John at Madison Square Garden in 1974, John chose to play a Paul song and opened it like this.
We thought we'd do a number of an old estranged fiancé of mine called Paul. This is one I never sang. It's an old Beatle number, and we just about know it.
But this sort of bond between George and John is not the only reason that this is a fantastic song. Here are some other reasons. The guitar tone is a force to be reckoned with. That distortion, it's quite something. Predictably, I spent a lot of time on the Beatles subreddit, and the guitar tone on Revolver is often cited as the best Beatles guitar tone. And I can definitely see the appeal. This is the hardest edged tone that I think they've had up until this point in their career. See, it gets a little edgier, a little harder, a little bit more distorted up until this album where it's snarling and really treble heavy. And they take this tone and they put it to great use on this song because they treat it like another lead instrument, almost like a voice. It's echoing the melody, it's teasing the melody, like the introduction opens with the guitar singing the melody for the I know what it is to be sad. And then it does that throughout the verses. I know what it's like to I know what it's like to be dead. I know what it is to be sad. Great. All leading up to this very juicy lick at the end of the verse, which sort of mirrors the and she's making me feel like I've never been born melody. The reason that you can achieve that is that you can bend notes on a guitar. You can't do that on a piano. If you tried to play that lick on the piano, it would sound like this. As opposed to like this. This lick undeniably goes hard. And the bass part does kind of a similar thing in that it follows the rhythm of the melody at the end of the phrases. I'll do some more bass singing, which I'm sure you've all been holding out for. Just reinforces that dun 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 rhythm. While that's happening, Ringo is living his best life underneath. Check it out. I know what it is. It's like the other three are establishing the rhythm so he can go full animal. There are some killer fills that Ringo is playing on this track. And the amazing thing is that almost all of them are some variation on crash. But he's emphasizing different beats. He's playing between the snare and the toms. He's achieving so much with so few drums. I know what it is. He's not actually syncopating any of the notes. He's not going like ba 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 ga-ta-ga-ta. It's all da-ga-da-ga-da-ga-da-ga-da-ga-da-ga-da. But it's da-ga-da-ga-da-ga-da-ga-da-ga-da-ga-da. Here's what it sounds like isolated. Because it was bad enough with the bass singing, we don't need me singing drums as well. This is what Ringo's full drum kit looked like. Now compare that with something like Jeff Porcaro's drum kit. It is so stripped back, and he's doing so much with so little. I actually feel like this period of Ringo's career is a bit of a peak. He has this loud, splashy crash, and he's doing, again, these really interesting fills. You can hear them on Hello Goodbye. I say no. One of my personal favorites, Strawberry Fields. Down, 'cause I'm going to. And he just goes ham on Rain. This is a song that they recorded at high speed and slowed down. So Ringo's original drum part was this fast. And then of course the last thing that makes the song really interesting to me is the lyrical content. It's not a love song. It covers much heavier themes than a lot of their earlier music. Death and birth and death and birth and death and birth. It's for all you Joni fans out there. But that's in keeping with an album whose cohesion, whose brilliance even, is found in the surprising variety of subjects and styles. Every new song is a surprise. This song is no different. A final thought about this song is that I'm usually a chord girly. I love a good set of chords. I love a lot of chords. This song is based around essentially 3 chords, and they are not complicated. They are no jazz chords. These are the 3 chords. And because of those 3 chords, it really feels like you could just lift the melody out of this song and drop it into other songs almost indiscriminately and it would still work.
She said, I know what it's like to be dead.
But that melody is compelling. It is so enjoyable. The song's arrangement, production choices are interesting ones. The performances are impressive. The tones of the instruments are attention-grabbing. And as I said, the bond between the 2 musicians singing on this track just jumps out of the recording. Plus it rocks out! Good old-fashioned rock and roll. Just loud, snarling, sneering, splashy. Ah! Good for the soul! And that is why this is my favorite song on side A. It's badass. But I want to know what you think. What is your favorite song on side A?
Whew! Halfway through. Seems like a good time to grab a biscuit or maybe make a sandwich. Take a breather, visit the powder room. I'll wait right here. If you enjoyed this series, I'll leave a link in the description for my Buy Me a Coffee, where you are most welcome to make a donation or sign up as a member if you wish, but no pressure, friends. If you're curious about what any of my original music sounds like, I will leave a link to that in the description as well. Otherwise, thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you here next time. Enjoy the rest of your day, folks.